This is Tucker Goodrich, and I am here with Dave Feldman, who everybody knows as the, I don't want to say inventor of the lipid energy model, and we'll get into that, but you're certainly the guy who's put it on the map as pertains to cardiovascular disease and diet and the interactions between the two. Happy to have you here, Dave. And I will disclose that Dave and I do a lot of discussing offline. When I told my wife that we were going to be doing this as an actual podcast, she was like, well, you two can talk for hours anyway, so that should be easy.
Yeah, thanks for
taking the time, Dave.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Tuck. And yes, you're right. While I may have put the model on the map, I'm happy to have a lot of colleagues that are really helping substantially expand on it. Naturally, I've got to mention Nick Norwitz and Adrian Sotomoda, especially, who have been really hard at work with me on the papers and many other aspects of the research. So it's amazing how much this is really, really expanded over time, which I know we'll have a chance to get into.
Excellent. So the motivation of this was getting some of the discussions that we've had offline, online, because every time we do one of those, I come away from it thinking, God, that would have made a great podcast. And primarily because a lot of people on Twitter have asked for kind of a concise explanation about how your ideas about the lipid energy model and my ideas about seed oil interact with and potentially modify the standard understanding of what causes cardiovascular disease. So maybe where we should start is just with the basic theory of cardiovascular disease causation. And I've included a couple of elements that we're pretty quickly going to say don't happen, just because if you go to a cardiologist, you are likely going to encounter some of these factors, even though the most recent research has kind of downplayed them or deprecated them. So maybe we can go through that first.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, I'll acknowledge up front that I'm going to do my absolute best to steelman the lipid hypothesis, as it's regularly referred to. I mean, I'll say that there's some debate as to how much it existed pre Brown and Goldstein, but Brown and Goldstein in the early 70s, of course, I think catalyzed it a lot more with their examination of those who had homozygous FH. As you know, Tucker, I've described this many times in discussion of our own study, the LMHR study that's out of Lundquist right now, because it's with folks who have otherwise low cardiovascular risk factors, which we may get a chance to get into because I have a lot to say about risk factors, but who outside of those risk factors have very high levels of LDL. And those early experiments that Brown and Goldstein, or rather the early evaluation Brown and Goldstein were doing in the early 70s, they basically determined that high LDL is clearly causal independently towards the development of atherosclerosis, because they were looking at children with homozygous FH, a genetic disease that results both in high LDL and in advanced atherosclerosis, thus seemingly satisfying the strength component of the Bradford Hill criteria. Like, it's so high and so clearly present such that these children were getting advanced symptoms of heart disease, such as angina at, like, say, age 3, and even having their first heart attack. It's sad to talk about, but their first heart attack when they're like 5 or 6, for example.
Right, and just a little background information. Brown and Goldstein won the Nobel Prize for their discovery of the LDL receptor. They are two of obviously the most famous cardiologists / scientists. I think they're both cardiologists. And they discovered the LDL receptor, which is how LDL gets into cells, the primary pathway. A whole bunch of caveats around that, but we'll just leave it there for now. And then they started doing some experiments with how LDL kicks off the atherosclerosis disease process. And Goldstein finally was instrumental in convincing Merck to introduce their statin drug into the market because of the effect that he expected it would have on people like those with FH who have really high LDL levels. So that's the significance of those two gentlemen. And we'll probably be talking about them quite a bit during the course of this. They're really, even all these years later, a lot of the seminal understanding of what causes cardiovascular disease from a mechanistic level comes from their work.
Yeah, and I mean, I have said this many times over in interviews, and I'll say it here now. I give them enormous credit for a lot of the physiology that was elucidated, even if I may have some hypotheses, and I know you do as well, that might run counter to where they were come from originally and possibly to what's getting presented to it now. I say even that with a lot of the reverence for a lot of what they did help to elucidate, and that lives on to this day. That's of enormous interest. I will expand a little bit on what you just mentioned, because this is kind of important and will probably come up in our discussions. There is multiple ways by which a lipoprotein, particularly LDL, can enter a cell and what the cell will then choose to do with it. And I think the key distinction that's, obviously changed in the last 50 years is that it's not just an LDL receptor, but that there's a whole family of receptors. In fact, there's, LRP, I believe, is low density lipoprotein, an LDL-like receptor protein. But the point is that there's all these different variations of ways by which there's interactions with lipoproteins that can be brought into a cellular membrane, and then what it does with it. And that actually is kind of an important thing to bear in mind, because it means you can't just watch one kind of receptor, or for that matter, one kind of receptor mutation, to best understand how it is that we're getting to this important disease that we're all interested in, which is, atherosclerosis.
Exactly. All right. So let's go through just the basic model of the widely understood model of what causes atherosclerosis. It starts with high cholesterol originally, and then LDL, which is a package of cholesterol, proteins, and fats, and then ApoB, which is ApoB is a protein that is found in LDL and in other lipoproteins in the blood. So it's started with cholesterol, they narrowed it down to LDL, and then they narrowed it down further to the ApoB molecule. And the thought was that high levels of these in the blood would cause a gradient, and that gradient would push LDL particles into the arterial wall. Thanks to Brown and Goldstein's work, it was recognized that in that process, they became oxidized, the cholesterol and or the lipid. This was thought to happen inside of the arterial wall. That then drives the progression of atherosclerosis, which starts off with inflammation, and then the recruitment of macrophages, which are a type of white blood cell, who attempt to, their job is to basically respond to inflammation and help to resolve it. In atherosclerosis, they don't. So we see inside the arterial wall these macrophages, this constant presence that turns into a plaque. A plaque is, if you want to think of it this way, it's like a pustule, a pus-filled lesion in the wall of the plaque. The body tries to heal it by laying down fibrotic tissues over the top of it, and the plaque can grow to the point where it occludes the vessel and potentially blocks the heart that way, or potentially bursts and then releases all the contents into the bloodstream, which can go up and block the blood flow through the heart, resulting in a heart attack, myocardial infarction, which is, of course, the heart attack part is how the concern with this all starts, right? Because nobody wants to die of a heart attack. So that's why we're interested in this whole topic, is to avoid dying of a heart attack at a young age.
Well, and I think it's worth, let's take everything you did and then walk it slowly, real quick, because that first step is the key step we're all interested in. Is if there's this cascade, if there's this positive feedback loop that starts with a higher concentration in the bloodstream of LDL particles, what ultimately initiates both the LDL particles getting into the arterial wall, and what then further activates the inflammatory response? Well, I think my Steelman version of modern lipid hypothesis as it stands today is, as you described, these ApoB lipoproteins. That's any of these complexes. They're both lipids and proteins, but they're known by one very large protein. In fact, I think it's one of the largest proteins we make in the human body is ApoB. It's a bunch of cargo that's on that ApoB, and at a higher and higher concentration in the blood, it was thought to be that it would passively diffuse into the arterial wall. As you described, it's almost like a pressure gradient, in that more and more would just get pushed through the cells that line our vessel walls, known as endothelial cells, either straight through the cell or through the junction gaps, or a combination between them. And I'll concede, I've always had a little trouble with that. The reason is because there actually is quite enormous control between endothelial cells and the junction gaps themselves.
Before we go into that, let's just say that it's plausible.
It's plausible, absolutely,
right? And it explains why you have this high level. It would explain why you have this high level in the blood, and then you see these LDL particles inside of an atherosclerotic plaque, along with a lot of cholesterol and a lot of fat, which are what the LDL cholesterol particle carries around. So it's a plausible model.
It's plausible. It not only is plausible, but I regularly state that over and over again. And that's where I was coming back around to. Is I'm not ruling it out. I'm just saying that the interesting aspect of it is, before, literally 5-6 years ago, I was suggesting then, and it was controversial to say then, that I think transcytosis, which is the process by which cells, particularly endothelial cells in this case, are by design binding to LDL particles and chaperoning them through the endothelial cell into the subintimal space where atherosclerosis is occurring, that I thought that might be relevant, as they may be participants in the immune response, that actually that endothelial cells may be intentionally moving them there. That was controversial then. I remember talking to, like, for example, Dr. Drew in 2018 about this. But as you know, this one key first step that I'm describing that was passive, that has now been recognized as more commonly in this field as indeed it isn't passive, and that there's more of a consensus that it's active in the way that I just described, that there is transcytosis. Endothelial cells are in fact moving LDL particles into the subintimal space, and it's believed that in places where there's not already inflammation, that might be what's happening, and then they get stuck. And when they get stuck, they're getting stuck to something called proteoglycans, which are kind of like stalks in the extracellular space that macrophages then come and accumulate to. Now, before moving any further, really want to zoom in on that. If in fact transcytosis is part of the process, and it's an active process, which is to say that the cell is expending resources to accomplish moving it from one side to the other, it has to bind via receptors. It has to expend ATP to capture it and bring it in. It has to make a vesicle that actually moves it across using transport proteins that actually moves it to the other side to then exocytose it to the outside. That's an active process because it requires those resources to accomplish this task. That's an important difference in how it is that was thought before. And that's actually something very testable. We should be able to see in existing endothelial cells right now with people at high LDL, this high level of transcytosis that also corresponds with this higher level of atherosclerosis. That should actually be something we could really see. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it goes along with the critics of the gradient theory have pointed out that the whole point of the endothelium, which is not just inside the blood vessels, but lying in the lining of your gut and, is to prevent things from moving through it,
To
right?
create a barrier.
It's a
Right.
barrier. And
Yeah.
the body has ways, famously in the gut, there's a chemical called zonulin, which releases the junctions in the endothelial layer and allows things to go through. It's thought to be involved in, it's clearly involved in celiac disease, but also in cholera, which is where it was first discovered. The cholera microbes reduce zonulin to open up the lining of the gut. And that's, the breakdown of the barrier is why cholera induces diarrhea, because you have fluid flow, uncontrolled fluid flushing out into the intestines, and then obviously, out. Well, we all know how that ends.
And let's zoom in on that, because I do want to make that distinction. I was discussing where it's a site that's non-inflamed, and a site that is inflamed, as in some endothelial cells, they've been damaged, right? Then you actually have more of a reason that LDL particles could have entered the space. You have two of them. One is that endothelial cells themselves separate from each other at a site of inflammation. That's literally part of their existing playbook, like in the presence of, say, mast cells, histamines, for example. This will result in it so that they become more porous on purpose, so that monocytes can be moved into them to become the macrophages we're talking about. So it's literally like there's trouble here. There's trouble in this space. Come find this area.
Well, it's like when you call for the firemen and they get to your house, first thing you do is open the door and let them in. You don't make them beat your door down.
Yeah. Now that's for the junction gaps. But importantly, in the last few years, this transcytosis that I just described, even though there's a normal amount that's happening in non-inflamed sites, there's an increased amount of transcytosis in the presence of inflammasomes. So inflammatory signaling molecules to endothelial cells increase transcytosis of LDL particles. That cannot be understated, right? In other words, this to me helps add further evidence, in my opinion, that endothelial cells are participants in the immune response and are actively moving non-modified LDL particles through those endothelial cells into the subintimal space. And I think it's plausible that this could be part of the innate immune response, which makes sense because a lot of the innate immune response is like a dog pile. It's like you're trying to just move everything that could be involved in that process to that space. And to me, that makes sense, since LDL particles, for example, can bind to pathogens. They have alpha tocopherol, so they have antioxidants as part of their monolayer, things along those lines. Not everything we need to elucidate, but I do think it's important for us to talk in those first couple steps with making the distinction between what is a non-inflammatory state and an inflammatory state of these endothelial cells that line our vessel walls. I think that's a big part of the bigger picture, right?
Right, exactly. So before we get too much into, basically, I'd like to discuss the modern understanding of cardiovascular disease, right? I mean, what we've described is a fairly simple model. Some parts of it, as you mentioned, with gradient, have been, our understanding has increased, let's put it that way, over what was thought previously. But go into your lipid energy model and how that pertains to the process of cardiovascular disease that we've discussed. Because I mean, basically, Dave Feldman, went on a keto diet, and you saw your LDL and your total cholesterol, if I recall correctly, skyrocket. And you were not happy about this.
No, I wasn't.
Because
I
I'm sure your doctor told you the same thing that my doctor told me when I did that. And I am not a lean mass hyperresponder the way you are. He said, I think you're going to kill yourself by doing this. I'm sure your doctor probably fell into his chair before he said, I think you're going to kill yourself. What did your
Yeah,
LDL start out at, and what did it get up to?
well, historically, my LDL was around 120 to 130, which if you look at Mesa and other data sets, that's almost like right in the middle. Like a male at my age at that time, that's like right straight smack in the central tendency.
Okay,
And
but you were overweight and unhealthy.
I mean,
Not
BMI of
hugely
like
overweight, but
25 to 26, maybe. I wasn't, nobody really thought of me as overweight, but I weighed then about 30 pounds more than I do now,
okay.
roughly. Right. And it's one of those things where you're looking around at your cohort, like I'm looking around at my class reunions, and I'm like, oh, well, we're all getting a little heavier. I guess it just happens with age. You think that way, right?
Right.
But yeah, I go on a keto diet. And first, I get the good news, which is that, oh, my weight's just dropping. Oh, now I'm back to what I was when I was entering college. How crazy is that? Oh, I'm running better. Oh, wow, I have more energy. I don't, I'm not crashing in the afternoons like I used to. Okay, everything's great, wonderful. But then I get the blood work, and exactly what you said. My LDL doubled, basically. It went to something in the neighborhood of, I want to say, 40 to 50, something like that. And for perspective, even though in the low carb community you hear these kinds of numbers all the time, for perspective, in the general population, that's in the top 10 of the top 1%. That's a very rare for so no question.
A big red flag to a
A big red
cardiologist.
flag. I was definitely scared and became obsessed with learning like what the heck happened, particularly given both my sister and my dad did not see this pronounced increase.
Okay. And this is
They
just to be clear, this is not only rare in general, but it's uncommon in people who go on keto diets. I mean, I went on a keto diet and honestly didn't see any change at all in my lipoprotein numbers.
Yeah. Now, I always say the same thing to everybody who ever says that to me. I always say, well, let me have control of your diet for a month, right?
Right.
Because everybody always says, I went on a keto diet, and I'm like, okay, but let me put you on my version of a keto diet. Because in effect, what you're describing is true. What I would say now that I didn't understand then is I know all the different levers that I believe create the exact scenario that I saw in myself, which is I had gotten very, very low carb. What many people might consider keto might still be, for example, fiber rich, which can be relevant towards total carbohydrates. It's also a matter of how truly lean you are, how much adipose tissue, that's your fat tissue, versus your lean mass, right? That's relevant. And also it's very relevant how much you're doing cardio. So for
Right. You
example,
used to run half marathons, if I remember
yeah, I
correctly.
used to run half marathons and a few times a full
Have you ever
marathon.
run a marathon, just out of curiosity?
I did.
Okay.
And under very rough conditions because I overestimated my capability, and it was what was called the Goofy Challenge in Disney World, where you run a half marathon on Saturday and then you run a full marathon on Sunday. And I thought I was trained up really well, and I set a personal record on my half marathon day, which was just idiotic. Just
I
if you
can
ever
only
wanted,
imagine how
yeah, if you
unpleasant
wanted
the next day
strong
must have been.
evidence of Dave can make some impressive mistakes, that was one of them. Don't set a pro record for your half marathon the day before you're going to run a full marathon. Anyway, okay, so what do I posit is happening? So we'll skip through a little, my bio you can look up on presentations and so forth. What do I think is happening? Well, those complexes, those ApoB containing lipoproteins, I believe in the context of where you really are powered by fat, and those other levers I mentioned, other ways by which serum cholesterol levels could be lowered for things other than being powered by fat. If those aren't in play, then you can see this pronounced increase because you have to traffic more of those fatty acids around in your bloodstream, both in what's getting released by your adipocytes. They're taking up and releasing. Yeah, your fat cells. They're taking up and releasing them at a faster rate. But also you're repleting them. You're refilling them at a faster rate. And you're doing that through these ApoB lipoproteins, which means that as these bloated VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins that are originating from the liver, are dropping off their triglyceride cargo at a faster and faster rate, that results in more downstream LDL particles and thus more LDL cholesterol. So as an easy way of putting it, you're seeing more empty boats. That's what we would posit, is that the LDL, the higher LDL cholesterol I was seeing back in 2015 and that I see today, is really a downstream result of more delivery, and for that matter, successful delivery of triglycerides, not just to my adipocytes, the fat cells, but also to a larger margin, relatively, a larger margin to my skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle,
right?
Because I'm just powered by fat.
Let's back out just a step, just basic fat metabolism through the body. You eat some fat, it goes down into your gut. It gets packaged into something called a chylomicron, which is an ApoB 48, which is 48% of the ApoB that they originally discovered, which is the one that your liver produces. So ApoB 100 means it's the entire thing, 100%. ApoB 48 means it's 48% of the one that your liver packages. So your gut, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. Your gut preferentially processes fat when you eat it, right? Everything that you eat goes into something called the portal vein and gets pushed into your liver, where your liver pre-processes and detoxifies anything in what you've eaten, right? This is a big problem for pharmaceutical companies doing drug delivery, because the liver tries to detoxify every drug you take orally, right? Because everything goes there except fat. Fat preferentially gets packaged up into these chylomicrons, these ApoB 48 particles, and sent into your lymph system, where they bypass the liver and they go directly into the blood, into your blood, right? And you can see this. I've seen videos demonstrating what happens to your body after you take a fat, you have a meal that's primarily fat. Your lymph turns from clear to white because it's full of fat, essentially. And then your blood changes to white as the chylomicrons go out into your general circulation. And from there, they are delivered to potentially every cell in your body, except for your brain, which has a barrier to that, right? So the cells will take it up. Obviously, anything that cells don't take up gets ultimately put into fat cells or processed by the liver, right? But they're getting preferentially routed around the liver to the rest of the body, right? Then once...
I can't speak as much to the portal vein. I am focused more on the enterocytes, which is what you're describing, the ones that package them into chylomicrons. There's actually quite a lot of interesting research, literally in the last few years. I know you're already familiar with some of this. For example, that we're finding out that the food I literally just had from breakfast this morning may not be what's going into my bloodstream predominantly, but rather the meal that I had from the night before is getting pushed into the chylomicrons that are actually making it out. So there's still some staging and pacing
in the gut.
Yeah, that's going on. But as you understand more on the ER and the whole packaging process, it starts to make more and more sense why it works in that fashion.
Right.
But I'm interested.
So then let me just go through the next phase. So the next phase is your cells have taken whatever they need from the chylomicrons. The remnant, loaded word there, goes to fat cells or to the liver. And the liver can then take that fat and repackage it into ApoB 100, what's known as very low density lipoproteins, right? And
yeah, but I want to pause because there's a very important step chylomicrons are first coming through the thoracic duct, and your heart gets first dibs on those chylomicrons. And that makes sense because your heart loves triglycerides off of lipoproteins. I can't repeat that strongly enough. There's a lot of evidence to show that, in particular, the heart expresses a lot of what's known as lipoprotein lipase, so much so that if you have some disease that inhibits the ability of using it, especially with your heart, it's very relevant. And they have animal models where if they delete it selectively on myocytes, they get into trouble. Well, I think that there's a good reason for that. I think that that's because there's a lot of power in those things. But
Well,
that's important.
That's a great point. I mean, the heart is the heart is as a muscle, the biggest consumer of fat in the body, right? It's the muscle that's continuously working. It prefers to run on fat, which is why.
If by consume, you mean utilize, actually to yield ATP. I mean, technically, adipocytes, your adipose tissue, your fat tissue, probably is the greatest stager and pacer, as it were, that is probably taking up triglycerides more than anywhere else.
But adipocytes are storage.
Right.
The heart is actually using it as a fuel source,
which is why I wanted to make that distinction. Right. I can't say that I know that for certain, but I can say that it's absolutely the greatest regular user. Probably it is, though. Probably I would say, and that's a lot to say because you have a lot of skeletal muscle, right? That's also using a lot of oxidative tissues outside of cardiac. But I would not be surprised if you found area under the curve. Yes, that we ultimately find the heart is the biggest, fat oxidation organ, relatively speaking, than all of them specifically for triglycerides off of lipoproteins. I keep making that distinction because I'm not even just talking about fatty acids that are released by adipocytes. I mean, your heart specifically likes the triglycerides off of those. So I'm sorry to have interrupted you. It's only because you were mentioning almost as if
not
they
only
went
a great point, but that specific factor that it goes straight through the heart from the thoracic duct is not something that I was aware of.
Yeah.
From the lymph system.
No, it's like I said, they get first dibs, and I think for a good reason. If you were into animal models and you rerouted it to where it came in from an extremity or something, I'll bet that'd be relevant to the health of the heart. Because it gets something like, I think it's around 70% in animal models. I don't know if we have it in humans, but around 70% of ATP yield originates from triglycerides off of lipoproteins. And that says quite a lot as far as how much the heart is leaning into it.
And one of the signature features of heart failure is that your heart becomes less capable of producing energy from lipoproteins and becomes more dependent on glucose.
Like I said,
failure is obviously
in animal models where they can selectively delete lipoprotein lipase on cardiomyocytes only, they get rampant heart failure. The animals die because their heart just stops working. They cannot compensatorily utilize glucose, ketones, or fatty acids enough to fill the hole of what's left from the triglyceride off of lipoproteins.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. Okay, that's kind of an important factoid there. While I process that revelation, so let's say digestion is finished, your heart got first dibs on the fats coming into your body, and it then goes into storage. Okay, let's say you're fasted. Fat cells will release fat in the form of either albumin bound, which is a protein in the blood that carries typically a single, I think it's just a single fatty acid. And then the liver will also it'll also release free fatty acids. The liver will take up these free fatty acids and repackage them into VLDL, right? Which is very low density lipoprotein. And VLDL, all of these lipoproteins are best understood. My geek mind here is thinking of how the internet works. The internet puts things into what are called packets, and each packet has an address on it. And that address determines, whether, where an email is broken up into all these packets. Each packet has a little address on it that determines where the packet goes. And when the packet gets where it's supposed to go, another piece of information on that packet tells the application on your phone or on your computer how to repackage these things back together, right? So your body's basically doing the same thing. Lipoproteins have different types of APO molecules on them. We talk most about ApoB 100 because that's the most prevalent, the most common one in the body, but there are...
It's also the non-exchangeable one. It's the only one that will...
It's the one that's always there.
It'll remain with it's the only one of any of these lipoproteins that will remain with that lipoprotein through its life cycle.
Right, exactly. Right. So VLDL goes out with some addresses on it or some markers on it that basically say, I'm a VLDL. If you need fat, you can grab me out of the bloodstream and take some of my fat out. And lipoprotein lipase, which Dave mentioned, is an enzyme that strips the fat out of the lipoprotein particle, right? So this is a lipid energy model, right? It's an energy delivery system. So go into exactly how that process works and why that's so pertinent to understanding lipoproteins in cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, I mean, it's effectively a sophisticated redistribution scheme. So if you're going to be powered by glucose, the mechanics of providing glucose in the bloodstream are super simple because glucose is water soluble and your blood is water based. So it's simple. You just toss it right in there. You could do this. You could do this at home right now. Grab some sugar, throw it in some water, right?
Right.
Now, conversely, take some oil or butter or something like that, throw it into water, and you find it clumps together. And that's a big problem. So what does your body do? It makes these things we're talking about, these lipoproteins, to make them soluble in water. They have a water soluble outside and they have a lipophilic inside. And I think it's to the genius of the body that it's very sophisticated in that it's not just having one of these for each kind of lipid that you need that's water phobic or that hydrophobic, but that it does it for all of them. It's like, oh, you want, your fat soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. We'll put them in there too. We'll put in the cholesterol. We'll put in the we'll put in the triglycerides. There's all kinds of other things we're still finding that we're making available to cells in like one big care packet, if you will, that are these lipoproteins. And so yes, often there's recognition, to bring it back to the larger arc from before, because that's where we're ultimately leading. There's recognition that this process actually is important, this distribution of these fat soluble but essential things such as fat soluble vitamins. You need vitamins, right?
Right.
So for example, if you're born with a disease where you cannot even synthesize these ApoB very effectively, it's called A beta lipoproteinemia, you have to megadose vitamins, these fat soluble vitamins I just mentioned, A, D, E, and K. You have to get them at like tens of thousands of IU, so that even though it's still very restrictive, you can at least get enough of them out there that your cells can get them.
Well, even before that point, people with that condition suffer serious developmental defects. And I don't remember what they are right off the top of my head. I was looking that up.
Depending on how severe the disease is itself. To the best of my knowledge, all versions of this that have been studied are some form of a heterozygous or at least slight or very partial synthesis of these ApoB, such that they still are getting some trafficking. But I'm not aware of any case of anybody who can make it out of utero without the ability to synthesize ApoB at all.
Well, that would be a significant interruption in your development process.
Right. And this gets to another aspect that's not published in the lipid energy model, but that I'm very interested in, Tucker, is since we're going down the geek road, which is the unpublished portion, but that I chat about regularly with like Adrian and Nick and so forth is the structural one. I do believe ApoB lipoproteins, it's not just the things I was talking about, the cargo on the inside, but that monolayer on the outside of lipoproteins that's made up of phospholipids and free cholesterol, which guess what, is also the bilayers of your cells themselves. So I certainly believe that part of the reason, for example, when I'm on a ketogenic diet and I have a huge bolus for several days of high fat, keto meals and so forth, and it's very hypercaloric, I see my LDL go down. I believe a portion of that can be explained by there being literally a greater structural demand for my adipocytes to grow. So they are not just taking the triglycerides off and then storing them. They're also, to some degree, endocytosing, literally consuming those LDL particles, or just even the VLDL particles in full, so as to then take them apart in their lysosomes and incorporate them into their own bilayer to accommodate the increase in volume necessary. But importantly, I think that's already happening all the time for all of us who are powered by fat, particularly the leaner you are. You have to keep expanding and contracting your cell bilayers for your adipocytes, because unlike stored forms of glucose, these are like smaller containers, if you will, relatively speaking, for the triglyceride mass that you're constantly redistributing. So bringing it back to the energy model, yes, I think I was then, and I think I am now, redistributing triglycerides at a faster rate than I was on a mixed diet. Why? Because I'm powered by fat. Why? Because glucose, when I was powered by glucose, that was easy to transport around. But where I was going in my prior point is that in the case of fat, that's a more complex process that requires making these lipoproteins and making use of them for not only dropping off these lipids that are an important component for us, but also in moving more of them so that the redistribution scheme can work at a faster and faster rate to meet the demand of what I'm using. So right. in the case of where I'm running more often, I suspect my LDL would get higher, all else being equal, because I'm using my cardiomyocytes more.
You haven't done that experiment, Dave? I find that impossible to believe.
Well, there's another challenge though. Whenever I would do like half marathons, I'd be sore, and that I think is a lever to the other side. If you have muscle tears or repair or growth, I believe you're also going to reduce your LDL particles for the same reason I just described on the growth of adipocytes. Now it's on the myocytes, except it's a permanent drop because they're literally taking it up. Right now, and I'll say this right now on a podcast, so it's public, I'm right now getting back into resistance training, working with Dr. Ben, actually. And I suspect my baseline LDL will be marginally lower. Not a lot lower, but marginally lower. Why? Because I think I'm literally consuming more of my LDL particles.
You're consuming the protein.
Well, not just the protein, though. I'm consuming the phospholipids and free cholesterol that I need to grow and repair my existing myocytes.
Right. But I think it's an important point that, these aren't just packages. The protein in these packages isn't just a delivery package. It's construction material, right? Your cell can break it down into amino acids that it can use for its own purposes, right? It's not like you're just, they're not just fat delivery, fat and cholesterol delivery mechanisms. So yeah, you would, I mean, and it's important to note, what Dave is saying here is surprising to some people, but it's not revolutionary. Brown and Goldstein, in a paper published, I think in the 80s, pointed out that 95+% of LDL comes from VLDL, right? So these particles are sent out from the liver, they drop off their payload, and then they're returned back. Cells grab them and use them for construction materials, and whatever's left probably goes back to the liver in some amount but repackaged as VLDL again.
And but this is where I make the distinction. The distinction is you're exactly right. They would say that this is basic physiology. I would say it's basic physiology. The key distinction here is that they would say after it's dropped off its major payload, it is now a toxic byproduct. That when it was VLDL and it was delivering things your cells needed, okay, we can get behind that. That's, you know, appropriate lipid physiology. But at the point where they become LDL particles, we got to get them out of circulation as quickly as possible, because now they have a net negative to your cardiovascular health.
Okay, I will disagree with that. But let's use that point as a way to segue. I agree there are people who do say that. I heard a famous internet doctor, who I will leave nameless at the moment, say in a podcast recently that we are all doomed to cardiovascular disease because we all have ApoB going around, and that ApoB is, as you said, a toxic thing that is going to give all of us cardiovascular disease if we don't reduce it to the greatest extent possible. Okay. So
you don't think that's the consensus opinion in lipidology right now, though, that LDL particles are a net negative, and that
let's go to the consensus opinion in cardiology, which is a couple of papers. There was a 2017 and a 2020 paper that were produced by the European Atherosclerosis Society. I'll put links to those in the notes. The 2017 paper was largely, I think I've read it a couple times, was largely epidemiology. And, you know, we're not going to go into that one. 3 years later, they felt the need to issue another one. And this one mainly went through the mechanism. So the first one was epidemiology and risk factors. The second one, they focused more on mechanisms, which is more interesting.
But the first one, crucially, the 2017 EAS paper you're describing, first one crucially says that there's a remarkable consistency in the higher and higher. I think it was at like 38 point something milligrams per deciliter increase in its cumulative effect of risk.
Right. A linear relationship between LDL levels and cardiovascular disease.
Log linear. It's important to emphasize log linear.
Right. Thank you.
But to that extent, wouldn't you say that supports that they would consider it to be net detrimental? The higher it is, thus the lower you can get it, the better, generally speaking.
If that's the only paper you read. So then we get to the 2020 paper, which focuses more on mechanisms. And one of the things Dave wanted to talk about on this was risk factors. And this is something I have a little bit of expertise in. I developed a large enterprise risk management system during my career on Wall Street, which we used, to get us through the 2008 mortgage catastrophe. We were one of the larger mortgage investors on Wall Street when that happened. I'm not going to go through that whole story, but it was pretty interesting. So risk factors. What did we do with risk factors when we were building this enterprise management system to help us manage trillions of dollars of assets, right? One of my developers who had a mathematics background came to me one day and sat down and said, Tucker, we're not using any risk factor analysis. I think we ought to do it. And he went through, all the pros and cons. And I said to him, risk factor analysis is what you do when you don't understand the system, right? We built a system where we got the specific parameters on every security, or almost every security, as many as we could, that we were invested in, so that when we built a big model to analyze what would happen to these securities when different things changed, interest rates go up or down, stock market goes up or down, blah blah blah, we would know exactly what was going to happen to these securities, right, prospectively. Now there's, huge garbage in, garbage out factor there, even there, because it's all based on the assumptions you make about what's going to happen in the future. But the model worked pretty well and predicted pretty correctly what wound up happening to our portfolio in the 2008 market meltdown. So it worked pretty well. And I said to the guy, what is risk factor analysis going to tell us? It's just going to tell us correlations between our securities, as if we knew nothing about what was in them, and other things that are happening at the same time in the market, right? Those correlations may or may not be meaningful. Sometimes they can be really helpful. I mean, a correlation analysis can tell you, for instance, that if you own a stock, which, you don't really have a lot of parameters with a stock, it can tell you that maybe that stock has a large subsidiary that's in a part of industry that you didn't recognize, but the market does. And so the price of that stock goes up and down based on other stocks that may initially look dissimilar, right? So it can help you like figure out what's going on, but it's ultimately not going to tell you what is going to happen with that specific company, because if it's a poorly managed company, it may go bankrupt, even though everybody else in the industry is doing really well. Or it may do really well when everybody else in the industry is doing poorly because it's super well managed, right? So factor analysis is interesting, but it is literally what you do for risk analysis when you don't understand what's actually going on. And unfortunately, in cardiology, and this is not a ding on cardiology, the body is an incredibly complicated system, orders of magnitude more complicated than anything I had to deal with on Wall Street, thank God. Meaning I had a much simpler problem to solve. But it also means that when you see things that are quote unquote risk factors, which means they are statistically correlated with other things, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything that's going to happen in your actual model in real life, right? Because they could be spurious correlations, they could be reverse causation. There are just a whole raft of ways in which a risk factor doesn't really tell you what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, this is
a rant.
yeah, no, but you're getting to the heart of what my concern is. I think that there's a very high level of confidence right now that you can, for example, take a basic lipid panel, total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL, triglyceride, and you can separate each of these markers and determine independently what their contribution is or is not to atherosclerosis itself.
Yes.
Such
that is a belief. Agreed.
Right. Such that you can determine the causality of one of them by doing a sensitivity analysis on the others. And I'm oversimplifying. I want to steel man as best as possible. I'm sure if the statistician was in the room, they'd go, well, it's not just on those. We're looking at a whole bunch of other things. But I think your argument is mine in that, look, we do still have an issue when we're looking at these things and they are collinear to each other in virtually all of these samples that we're looking at. And this is why what I think the lipid energy model, and for that matter, the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, is going to provide a truly unique opportunity for, is that I believe, and I advanced for now several years, that we unfortunately keep looking at populations that either have partial or exclusive focus on those with some form of dysfunction in their lipid metabolism. And I posit that lean mass hyperresponders have a functional form of lipid metabolism, and in fact, one that, because it's reliant on fatty acid trafficking, results in this very high level of LDL. But absent the other cardiovascular risk factors that I'm mentioning tend to be collinear with LDL, such as metabolic syndrome that results in the low HDL and higher triglycerides, things like that. So in a roundabout way, I'm interested in this because of the very thing Brown and Goldstein were talking about. I would gently say that, with all the reverence and respect that I give to their work, that it's not just that those children with homozygous FH had only a high LDL alongside higher cardiovascular disease, I would posit that there's a dysfunction at a cellular level of the lipid metabolism, especially of things like the immune cells, such as macrophages, that I think are very relevant when looking at this outcome of cardiovascular disease in those with homozygous FH. And guess what? For the first time, we're now going to have a population that, for other reasons, have higher LDL than this disease, such as monogenetic FH, for what I think is going to be a functional lipid metabolism that we're scanning in our existing study. But do I think, looking at those risk factors, they could have quantified it such that they determined that that was causal to the point where we don't even need to study lean mass hyperresponders? I vehemently disagree with that. And yet I've been arguing with people on the internet about it for like half a decade now. Fortunately, we'll have data soon to confirm or disconfirm that directly.
Well, and I think, the folks who believe that LDL or ApoB is causal of heart disease don't like, I think it's a combination of they don't like the work that you're doing because they don't think it's necessary, right? The simple explanation, they think that we've got all the evidence we need and this isn't going to add anything to the evidence body. Or the other explanation, somewhat less charitably, is they're threatened by it and they don't want you to poke a large hole in it. Because if you, Dave's work is essentially that in folks like Dave, if you have a triad of high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides, that you are not going to be susceptible to cardiovascular disease. Is that a fair way to put it succinctly?
I mean,
or at less risk, at least.
Yeah, I'm going to, again, I'm going to try to steelman what I think would be the counter position, and certainly one that I've gotten more recently as we started the study, which is, hey, maybe you are at lower risk if you have this triad, this high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides, but you would be at an even lower risk if you had all the same things as lean mass hyperresponders, but with a low LDL, which, by the way, I'll readily concede is possible. The thing is, that's not how the current guidelines, or for that matter, modern medicine is treating lean mass hyperresponders today. There's not a bunch of lean mass hyperresponders talking to their doctors, and their doctors are saying, oh, actually, you're a pretty low risk, but it's suboptimal low risk. I think that you're in, say, lowest risk quarter for the population, but I'd prefer if you were, lower, but, that's up to you. Because as you know, clinicians, they typically don't get into large arguments with low risk patients, even if like a low risk patient says, yeah, I like to have a cigar once in a while, as an example of something where it seems that though a lot of people would speculate that's probably not beneficial on net. Now, I myself, I just don't know either way. And I want to be as generous as I can to my own critics, because I genuinely think most of them are coming from a good place. They really do believe that it is detrimental to have high LDL, and they may be right. But at a minimum, I think we should at least move head on into the magnitude question to begin with, which is, look, are they at a high risk? If I myself, going back to me in 2015, could I tell me myself back then, oh, you know what, actually, I can't tell you if you're at a marginally higher risk, but I can tell you if you're at a substantially higher risk, given the LMHR study today. I think we at least owe that to those people who found enormous efficacy, especially for medical conditions they have, for which they found a new lease on life with something like keto.
Right.
Because right now they're scared to death that they're making the wrong decision that's going to give them advanced heart disease right away. And for those folks, yeah, if you're going by the present lipid hypothesis, if they've got monogenetic FH levels, then that's what is expected by the current science. We should at least be able to get that answer to them.
Right. Okay. So let's discuss. So you asked me if I think that it's the consensus that LDL causes heart disease. That was the title of, that was what one would come away with if one read the title of those two studies, right? When one drills down into the 2020 paper, the one that's actually that's focusing more on the mechanisms and less on the epidemiology and the risk factors, one comes across a reference to Brown and Goldstein's early work, right? And what they did was they having discovered what they thought was the explanation for how LDL, well, they just in the course of examining familial hypercholesterolemia, which is caused by the symptom of which, the sign of which is very high cholesterol, and in some people, it's important to note, in some people, early cardiovascular disease, right? It doesn't happen in all of them, and that's because probably whatever genetic thing they have, often you don't just have one genetic defect, you may have several, and there's interrelations and blah blah blah. There's a whole lot of things going on there. So what they discovered the LDL receptor. The LDL receptor got them the Nobel Prize, and they discovered that people with FH had a dysfunctional LDL receptor, and this is why they had high LDL, because the purpose of LDL is as a energy and construction delivery package, and these people are not able to take it up, so they have lots of it in their cell, right? Dave is speculating that if he starts exercising consistently, it's going to go down because his body's going to be taking more of them out of circulation, because Dave does not have FH. Dave has functional LDL receptors. So what they discovered, and then they said, okay, well, let's show that we can initiate atherosclerosis by exposing monocytes, which white blood cells, which become macrophages, to high levels of LDL. And in atherosclerosis, one of the first steps is that these macrophages engorge themselves with it is thought LDL, and turn into something called a foam cell, right? So the difference, a foam cell is basically a macrophage that is stuffed full of LDL, right? So they exposed macrophages to LDL and nothing happened. That's a bit of an issue, right? With the mechanistic understanding. Now, 2020 European Atherosclerosis Society consensus, this is still the current understanding of what's going on here, right? Native LDL does not initiate atherosclerosis. Something has to change in the LDL particle. Brown and Goldstein used something called acetylated LDL, which is a chemically modified LDL that doesn't exist in the body, but it does cause macrophages to hoover up these acetylated LDL particles and to become foam cells, right? So I think it's important
to make a distinction that we all care about, which is at the point that it's modified, it actually is not going to get bound to an LDL receptor. An LDL receptor binds to non-modified LDL particles.
Not quite true. That's not quite true. There is a gradient of modification that occurs. We're back to a gradient. There's an LDL particle, we talk about it like it's an atom, but it's not. It's a very complicated thing with one LDL protein, but with, hundreds to thousands of pieces of cholesterol and triglycerides in it, right? There's a lot going on in this little thing. So there's a gradient of modification that can happen, right?
Agreed. But I think the key, go ahead.
So there's a minimally modified LDL, and the definition of that is it is still accepted by the LDL receptor. Then there's a modified, or they have various terms they use for it, LDL, that is no longer, to your point, recognized by the LDL receptor, but can be taken up by other receptors, which they termed scavenger receptors, because from a cardiovascular point of view, they are thinking, strictly in terms of the lipid impact on cardiovascular disease. A broken LDL particle clearly needs to be scavenged, right? But these scavenger receptors are found in every cell in the body, and they do important things like allow you to absorb fat, or they sit in your tongue and they allow you to taste fat when you eat it, right? So these are not scavenger receptors. They're, a normal part of the body. I hate that little terminological error there.
But can we pause just a moment longer on that?
Yeah.
You're 100% right in that everybody needs to think of these in 3D space. A minimally modified LDL particle can bind to a non-scavenger receptor, fully functional LDL receptor onto its normal binding domain, right? But the reason what I was trying to drill into was the context of the activation itself, right? So in the case of where you're not modifying the LDL particles and putting them in the presence of macrophages, there's not an inflammatory process in play. That I think is extremely relevant as to whether or not the macrophage.
Say that again.
So a macrophage is not in the presence of a site of inflammation. Do you think that becomes relevant as to whether or not it's going to take up non-modified LDL particles on purpose?
It will. I mean, macrophages will take up some non-modified LDL, but they will not do so to the extent that they become pathogenic, which is the foam cell, right?
And I have a good reason to suggest for that, which is that monocytes have to grow after they enter the subintimal space to 5 times their size in becoming and differentiating into a macrophage.
Right. Which
brings me right back to the available phospholipids and free cholesterol to grow those bilayers. It's not a stretching of things. People tend to think of these things.
Right. You're saying they're taking up these LDLs as the normal course of business, as a potentially healing,
and that's extremely relevant. If that lipid, if there's a dysfunction in the lipid metabolism, even for non-modified LDL particles in the subintimal space with the physiology of macrophages. So why I'm bringing this up is the experiment you described that Brown and Goldstein were doing. That's an in vitro study, and this is always going to be a problem because, of course, it's outside the human body and the tissue dynamics and heat.
Well, and they were quite clear about that. I mean, it was a type of LDL that doesn't exist in the human body. So yes, it's about as in vitro as it's possible to get. It's
right, but macrophages, big eaters, they do grow based on how much they have to invaginate and depending on what the demands are. It has never once made sense to me that they would eat things and then stop moving and then just die in place because they're actually quite mobile. And so,
their job is to take this stuff away somewhere else.
Yeah,
right.
Depending on their differentiation. Right.
It's like, if your house, I think you mentioned this in a recent talk that you did. It's like if your house is damaged, the first thing that you need to do is take all the damaged bits away, and then you can rebuild it with good bits. And hopefully at the end of this process, your house will look the way it did before anything happened.
Yeah, and it might be that you have those bits inside, it's drywall. You may already have drywall in your garage that's ready to use. But also there's these these trucks that are constantly going by, these Home Depot trucks that have those bits on board. Right. And you could be like, oh, can I just go and use some that you have that you're bringing by? That's kind of relevant.
Right.
But yeah, no, the only reason I paused initially, I know we're having a good time geeking out. Hopefully we wouldn't lose everybody by this point. But no, the binding domains, thinking of them 3-dimensionally, I think is extremely relevant. But as far as what their expression and acceptance is, that is largely downstream of instructions from the nucleus based on instructions it has. And I think that that's extremely relevant when looking at the milieu of both modified and unmodified LDL particles. So yeah, basically where I'm drilling into, and that I know you're interested in as well, is what gets this process started outside of an inflammatory stimuli. That's where I'm getting very interested. How can you initiate and progress this cascade of development of atherosclerosis without there being a site of inflammation or present inflammasomes in the first place, right? And that's what I'm especially interested in.
Okay.
But go ahead. Sorry.
I would say the answer to that is you can't. And I think that's okay. So we've established that Brown and Goldstein established that these LDL particles have to be modified to be pathogenic, right? And they couldn't figure out what modification was. Two other gentlemen, also cardiologists, I think they're both cardiologists and scientists, Wisdom and Steinberg, came along and, I misspoke before, by the way. It wasn't Goldstein who convinced Merck to produce statins, it was Steinberg. They figured out what it was that changes in the LDL particle, and were able to demonstrate this in rabbits and humans, that this change makes the LDL particles more susceptible to becoming modified, right? And that change is oxidized lipids, particularly an oxidized omega-6 lipid called linoleic acid in the lipoprotein, right? Now, this gets us back to hypothesis evaluation, let's say, right? If you have a hypothesis that all swans are white, and you see lots of white swans, they're confirming your hypothesis. All swans are white, right? And this was Nassim Taleb's great book title, The Black Swan. But then you go down to Western Australia and you see, oh, they have black swans down there. Well, that's the end of your hypothesis, right? All swans are white is debunked. You now have to say most swans are white, or swans outside of Australia are white, or, you know, however you want to modify it to adjust it to the facts. So what the EAS consensus paper to me makes very clear is that, and they go through a couple of different modifications that are present in serum of non-normal LDL that are involved in the pathogenic process. And in fact, they have a nice little chart, which I will probably pop up here in post-production, showing the process starting with what Steinberg and Wisdom called oxidized LDL, right? So what about folks who don't have oxidized LDL, or have, you know, a less than pathogenic, since there's a gradient in a spectrum of LDL? What about those people, right? And the answer to the idea that ApoB is universally promoting cardiovascular disease is belied by the existence of populations who don't have cardiovascular disease, or don't have it to an extent that results in what we care about, which is a heart attack and death, right? And there are multiple populations, not just one or two, but there are multiple populations around the world who, you know, and if you start looking at it historically, you come up with a very interesting population who is known not to have cardiovascular disease, and that's people with familial hypercholesterolemia. That has only led, according to, I'm going to look his name up here. This was Peter Attia had this gentleman, John Castellan, I think his name is.
This is a recent one, right?
This was a relatively recent one. And he said something that made my ears perked up. He said people with FH didn't get heart disease prior to 1860. It turns out that they had, Castellane, anyway, I'll put it in the show notes. People prior to 1860 didn't get heart disease. So even the FH people, the people who are supposed to be most susceptible to this ApoB-induced cardiovascular disease, weren't always in that position. They didn't always get heart disease, right? And it explains even currently, a lot of them don't get premature heart disease. Some, as you pointed out, like Brown and Goldstein's patient, who was a little girl, do, but apparently that didn't used to be the case, right? So it suggests, it doesn't
I
suggest.
listened to that one. I don't remember that particular passage.
I had to go back and write that one down. I looked up his paper, and it's right in front of me, and I'll put it in the show notes.
I will say, though, that I am already familiar with some research that goes through, and I can't say I know for certain it's monogenetic FH, but I'm pretty sure it's at least monogenetic FH, or what is traditionally considered high-risk polygenetic FH alongside monogenetic FH. I can't remember if he shared if it had gotten published yet, but I'll just say that I'm aware of research that definitely suggests some clear heterogeneity in that population.
Right. George Davey Smith, the epidemiologist at Harvard, whose claim to fame, heaven help us all, is that I don't know if he invented Mendelian randomization, but he was certainly one of the guys who really made it well known and well utilized, observed that FH people get cardiovascular disease in the context of what I would call an industrial diet.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to derail you from where I think you're going on this, but on that note, it is true that I would like there to. I'm not somebody who tosses out epidemiology overall. I think it's actually quite exceptional for hypothesis building. I just think, and I'm pretty sure you share this opinion, there's way too much confidence that's invested in it for claims of causality that I think need to be verified. Like again, great for hypothesis building, great if there's strong Bradford Hill signaling. Oftentimes people think they've met the threshold Bradford Hill himself would have considered strong, and I guarantee if you read up on him, he has a very, very high threshold for what he considered that he would call strong. But even then, you still want to find more direct and material data, and ideally get to the point where you've got some forms of RCT or so forth, to where basically you just don't need things like sensitivity analyses to do most of the heavy lifting. But to where I think you're going, and certainly an interest of mine, yes, how much can we look to people on diets outside of what is typically considered now very common for Western civilization? I'm always interested in that. Unfortunately, that pool is getting smaller and smaller by the day.
Right.
It's getting challenging to just try to find people on a variety of different diets that were ancestral cuisines for their their geography. We actually we recently, for this documentary that I'm in, we're trying to find more native Inuit that were on more of their native diets. And
good luck.
Yeah, sometimes I want to say this without sounding super cynical, but I feel like we've exported, like the US in particular, that we've kind of exported. It sometimes feels like it's a virus that's just kind of going over through the world and eventually getting everywhere. Like I'm pro freedom for people to have their own choice on what they consume. But sometimes I lament how popular the worst parts of our diet are to other parts of the world.
Right.
But what do you do?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, people refer to it as the standard American diet. I prefer to refer to it as the modern American diet, MAD, mainly because there's good evidence that the diet that we ate back before 1860 didn't have the pathogenic outcomes that our current diet pretty clearly does. I mean, there are people who argue that, the modern American diet as typified by the dietary guidelines is a good idea, but I think that that's a real rough argument to make in light of 90% of the American population being sick with some form of metabolic syndrome. Anyway,
So let me be devil's advocate to where I think you're going. As with epidemiology, if let's say I was looking before at data before 1860, I would go, oh, well, there was also more sunlight, there was also more exercise, there's also more things that are confounders when trying to look at it epidemiologically. Where can we look to existing data where populations have something that clearly seems to be more of a distinct intervention for which most, if not all, other variables remain the same? And especially if we can find a particular dietary component that seems to exacerbate heart disease considerably.
Well, let's talk about a better way to get data. I agree. I mean, it's actually pretty surprising how good some of the mortality registries were back before in the early part of the 1800s and the late part of the 1700s. I've gone back and looked at some of that stuff. It's pretty interesting. I mean, we would say well ahead of their time, but of course they weren't, because they were doing it in their time. And to your point, it's really hard. There's a certain class of research that's not possible to do anymore because everybody in the world has adopted to some extent this sort of diet. I mean, the Eskimos, the Inuit, there are very few populations in the world where you can go to where they don't get some form of American influenced food. But back in the 60s, that wasn't so true. And there was a remarkable study that was done in the 1960s looking at the geographic distribution of ischemic heart disease. And they specifically, now this is, I guess, a species of epidemiology, but it's a fairly robust species of epidemiology, because what they did was not go and interview people and ask them whether or not they had had a heart attack. They went to morgues and they analyzed the hearts of dead people, right? Because unlike a lot of other organs, when the heart has damage, it can form scar tissue, but it can't repair itself, right? Heart cells, myocytes, don't divide, right? So when they're damaged permanently. And this means that if you have a heart attack, even if it doesn't kill you, it permanently leaves a mark on the heart that can be read in an autopsy, right? So now the argument that ApoB causes cardiovascular disease is essentially an argument saying heart disease is a genetic disease, right? Virtually everybody has ApoB, except, as we discussed, for some rare genetic situations, right? Virtually, it's safe to say everybody has ApoB. Therefore, heart disease is a genetic disease, right? It follows. ApoB comes from our genes. So they looked specifically at that hypothesis, and they did that by looking at different populations inside and outside of the United States, right? At autopsy, they looked at their hearts. In some cases, they shipped the hearts back to the United States so they could make sure that the autopsy was being done in a consistent way across all these different populations. And they found that particularly Asians and African Americans in their native environment had 0 or near 0 rates of cardiovascular disease, right? In Nigeria, they looked at 4,500 hearts from dead people, and they found a single heart that had evidence of a myocardial infarction. Whereas in the United States, in African Americans, it was, if I remember correctly, 12 or so percent. Now, remember, this was back in the 1960s, back when African Americans in the United States had much lower rates of heart disease than white Americans. Now it's much higher, right? White Americans had, I think it was in the 20% range at autopsy, regardless of what they died of. They had this evidence of having had a heart attack. And then Japanese, for instance, in the United States, I think had 18%. They were almost as high. But in Japan, it was like 3% in Tokyo and in the low 1% outside of Tokyo. So there was this huge variation in the rate of cardiovascular disease across populations, right? And their statement was, so clearly it's not a genetic disease. There's something in the environment that's causing these populations to move to the United States and then start to, revert to the mean of a high rate of cardiovascular disease in the United States.
If I were playing devil's advocate and I were pushing back on that particular finding, what I would likely be aiming for is the per capita wealth of the populations being looked at, as in if the amount of money you have to spend for food as a fraction of your total income is going down, it means that you can consume more, and therefore, you might literally be just eating more food. Were things like BMI, I realize this is a lot more difficult post-mortem, but were things like that assessed to where they could determine other symptoms typical of, say, metabolic syndrome?
Well, don't forget, this was in the 1960s. So metabolic syndrome hadn't yet been recognized as an issue, right? What's interesting, I think, is that they did include Japan, which was a first world country, right? And while Japan had a major problem with starvation at the end and after World War II, for most of the Japanese history, most of modern Japanese history, Japan as a first world nation, they were able to eat as much as they would like, right? And what's interesting is that there are other studies that were done around the same time that looked at what happened to Japanese people when they come to the United States. And they do put on weight, they do become more obese, they do start adopting the American diet and also adopting the American pattern of chronic diseases. Things like colon cancer go up, as well as cardiovascular disease, right? So there's clearly, now the most interesting part, I think, of that data set is what happened in Okinawa. The Okinawans stayed in Okinawa, which is the southernmost part of the Japanese archipelago. But they were occupied by the United States. And one of the things that the United States did was introduce fast food restaurants, right? So the Okinawans didn't move anywhere. They just started eating American fast food, and their rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer skyrocketed, as did their rates of obesity. So, in the scheme of epidemiology, with all the problems that there are, that's a pretty darn good data set in my estimation, right? Okay, this population has a much lower rate of this disease than this other population, so let's transfer the diet, keep everything else the same, right? Now it's possible that it could be something else, like, a virus that Americans carry, that wherever we go, we infect the local people, or if they come here, they get the virus. Yeah, there are other explanations, but as far as I know, there's no evidence for anything like that. And we can induce this in animals by changing what we feed them, right?
So I went through my lipid energy model. This obviously is a good spot for you to go through your model, in particular as it relates to cardiovascular disease. What is it you think best explains this?
Well, so the EAS 2020 consensus paper says basically that in order to become pathogenic, normal LDL gets modified in one of a couple of ways, right? There's oxidized LDL, which is typically determined by a test looking at malondialdehyde. We'll say where that comes from. There's aggregated LDL, and there's electronegative LDL, right? And they also start talking about something called triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, which is a specific area of expertise of the first author of that paper, Jan Boren, right? Now, triglyceride-rich lipoproteins is a term they shouldn't really be using, because basically what they are is chylomicrons that have delivered their fat payload, right? Okay, so
Let me actually help you out a little bit on this one, because it's absolutely true. We should just make a quick distinction between those two categories. The lipid energy model posits you are literally intentionally trafficking more triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. The thing is, it's coupled with a greater turnover, as in they are being delivered successfully over and over again. So
right.
you absolutely, everybody watching this right now, you absolutely right now are secreting triglyceride-rich lipoproteins into your bloodstream right this minute. Guaranteed.
How many a day?
I couldn't tell you how many a day, but I can actually tell you, in case you're interested, because I have done math on this, how many LDL particles you have in your bloodstream right now. They're measured in nanomoles per liter, and what is considered to be the cut point right now is 1,000 nanomoles per liter. And if you sit down and do the math, that comes to 3 quintillions. A quintillion is a million trillions, or a 1 with 18 zeros after it, to give.
That's a lot of freaking lipoproteins.
Yeah, to give you a reference point, because that's not going to make a lot of sense to a lot of people. It's estimated we have 7.5 quintillion grains of sand around the world. That is every beach, every desert, all through the ocean, all of them. That's how many grains of sand there are in the world. And our body turns over about that many about every 2 weeks, right? So it's literally, it's maneuvering that many standard, right? Now,
yeah, I remember the first time you told me that number. It just blew me away. It still blows me away.
Yeah, now here's the thing. LDL particles themselves, if you average them at 22 nanometers in diameter, right? And if you were to take a bucket of 5 liters, which is about the blood volume of a human, and just put a whole bunch of spheres that are 22.5 nanometers into that bucket, you'll end up with approximately, I don't know the exact name of the type, but it's a 4 with 21 zeros after it. So that same 3 with 18 zeros I mentioned from before, that means that you have about 3 per every 4,000 in volume. In other words, it takes up less than 1,000th of your total blood volume. 1,000 nanomoles per liter. It takes up less than 1,000th of your total blood volume. It's I think 0.00075. And so an increase to 2,000 nanomoles per liter is twice that. It's 0.001.5, or sorry, 1.5. Anyway, the reason I mention this is you mentioned earlier how you can in fact see the fat in your blood. If you have, like, say, a high fat meal goes into the blood and you don't have an insulinemic response such that it quickly shuttles away that fat. That's true. Potentially you can see fat.
You always have that, because it takes a little while to package everything away.
Yeah, but where I'm going with this is, if you look at my fasted blood test, it does not look like that. I've seen my blood a million times spun. If I'm fasted and my triglycerides are under 100 or under 1,000 milligrams per deciliter, you can't see it. When it's spun, it's clear. It's totally clear.
Right.
And the reason I mention that, in contrast to what I just said with all that math, with all those things, is the actual volume of LDL particles is teeny. But triglyceride-rich VLDL, the precursor to those LDLs, if they're in a large supply alongside chylomicrons, they're actually visible to the human eye because of how much triglycerides are in them.
Right.
Now, because I wanted to time out you, because it's super relevant to me if you're looking at triglyceride-rich lipoproteins and their association with cardiovascular disease, because I am absolutely going to point out, hey, wait a sec, don't lump these two things together, because whether those triglyceride-rich lipoproteins are successful in delivering their triglyceride cargo is super important to me in this lipid energy model. And right now, they're lumping LDL particles with triglyceride-rich ApoB lipoproteins like VLDL and chylomicrons. And I think you shouldn't do that because this category is called remnants, which is what you mentioned from earlier. And if you fasted for 12 hours and you still have triglyceride-rich lipoproteins in your bloodstream at a sizable threshold, that to me suggests that you are not doing a good job of parking them. You're not getting those triglycerides put away properly. I'm not surprised that that'll have a higher association with cardiovascular disease because it'll have a higher association with hyperinsulinemia and being well past your personal fat threshold. So that whole category is of interest to me because that suggests a trafficking issue that is okay. So this is an edit point because apparently I just cut out, but in short, I'm very interested then in seeing triglyceride-rich lipoproteins in a fasted blood test, because if I fasted for 12 hours, actually my blood shouldn't be triglyceride-rich because it likely will have successfully delivered all the triglycerides to tissues.
Right.
And therefore, it's likely not that visible. But if somebody else, if a family member of mine has high triglycerides after being fasted for 12 hours, there's no good reason to have a lot of fuel substrate floating around in your bloodstream after a long fast. There's no good reason for that. It should, your body should have done its job in shuttling away energy and otherwise still making what's available there. And that's why I went through the math of LDL particles. In spite of very sizable numbers of LDL particles, they actually take up a teensy tiny part of the volume of your bloodstream. Whereas triglyceride-rich ApoB containing lipoproteins, the precursor, especially VLDL, the precursor of LDL, still being very present in the bloodstream, along with things like chylomicrons. That to me is a bad sign. That suggests a larger systemic problem like hyperinsulinemia and an inability to deliver triglycerides to your tissues, probably because they're not taking them up. Probably because your adipocytes are not taking up those triglycerides, your oxidative tissues. They don't need them either. You have this level of toxicity that I think has this downstream result in the triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, which, of course, as you know, are called remnants. And I don't like that they're lumping them all together in that whole ApoB lineage. But then again, that's why we need to get this data. Lean mass hyperresponders, they have high levels of LDL, but they have low levels of remnants. They have triglyceride-poor lipoproteins. And that's an important distinction. So I do want to separate that category. Triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, I put in a different category from the ones you just now talked about, the other types for which there's going to be differences in the lipoproteins themselves.
Right. Your point about properly functioning lipid metabolism. You shouldn't have, I mean, essentially what's happening both with...
One is systemic, and one is granular in the composition of the monolayer of the lipoprotein itself. Whereas I would argue the triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, that has more to do with how much the system, the body itself, is utilizing them successfully or unsuccessfully.
Utilizing them or able to, back to my point about packets and addressing, able to read the packets and able to clear them out correctly. I think there's probably, although it's tough to measure, but there are, the fact that these packets get damaged to the point where they can't be taken up by, for instance, the LDL receptor suggests that there is levels of damage that may result in an inability to clear these packages, which is why, small dense LDL, which is highly susceptible to oxidation and probably has undergone some oxidation, is so sky high in people with high cardiovascular disease risk, right? It indicates that the whole process has gotten foobarred somehow, right? So
yeah, but I don't start with myself. I'm not starting with the assumption LDL particles cells are attempting to clear ApoB containing lipoproteins and are failing at it. That assumes it's a failure on the part of the cell in spite of the cell intending to.
Well, No, the cell intends to take up a properly formed particle, right?
If it's the prerogative of the cell, but that depends on what the status of the cell is itself.
Right, exactly. But we're assuming that over the context of the entire body, there's going to be a continuous demand for these things.
How much? How much of a continuous demand? Does that change? I think it changes.
Oh no, it absolutely changes. And I mean, one of the interesting things that I've seen papers on in obesity research is something called RQ, respiratory quotient, which is a measure of carbohydrate versus lipid oxidation, right? An RQ of 1 is 100% glucose. An RQ of 7 is basically zero glucose. That's an oversimplification, but we'll kind of run with that, right? And what they find is that people with a continuously high RQ tend to get obese over time. Well, okay. I mean, according to your model, they are constantly eating fat or producing fat from carbohydrate, because that's what the body does with excess carbohydrate. And they're not ever burning it. So it's got to go into storage, and it's coming back out, but it's never getting utilized. And it's going to, you know, just like a bathtub with the drain plugged, they can't ever get rid of their fat because all their body is using for fuel is glucose.
Actually, that's a good analogy, because what happens when a bathtub is starting to get over full is usually you have a fail-safe that's near the top but not the top. That becomes a kind of separate drain. That's how I think of ectopic fat.
Right.
So it's not that the cells that you normally want to be interacting with lipoproteins are still wanting to interact with them and failing. I would argue they're just at a status where they don't want to interact as much, leaving it to tissues that are not typically designed to take up the fat to do it instead, such as the pancreas, such as the liver, such as the heart, right? Yeah, exactly. Right. And so this is an important distinction that I think keeps getting missed, because I think it's a problem with all gradient versions of ApoB lipoproteins, and it might be a difference between you and myself, in that I don't know how much I feel confident that LDL particles that would otherwise be getting cleared, were it not for the specificity of the LDL particle, as opposed to anything related to the systemic breakdown, is the problem. I don't know that yet. I don't feel that I've met that level of confidence yet, because those types of LDL particles tend to be part of a common pattern, a common lipid pattern that tend to be downstream of things like hyperinsulinemia. So I need to see I need that distinction systemically to feel confident that that's the etiology of the disease. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
But that brings us back to your hypothesis with regard to the compositional difference of the LDL particles. And because I think yours is a concentration gradient, right? As in, if you have more and more oxidizable susceptibility.
Well, I still don't think you can say it's a concentration gradient. What you're shifting, I mean, what Steinberg and Whitstone showed is that LDL uptake in macrophages particularly, and this affects, it's an important thing that we discussed a while ago. This doesn't just affect macrophages. The smooth muscle cells in the lining of your artery also undergo this process, and in fact can transform into something that looks very much like a macrophage and then a foam cell, right? They're basically like getting deputized into the role of an immune cell to help clear damage. So what we know about this process is that there's a rate limiter on how much LDL you will take up, right? It's demand driven essentially. Whereas when you damage an LDL particle enough so that it starts being taken up by a scavenger receptor, you're then in the take up as much as you can until it's gone mode, right? you're attempting to limit damage, because it's important to note that when these cells become modified, they become toxic. They become toxic to endothelial cells, to the endothelial cell wall, to the macrophages, to the smooth muscle cells, right? To any cell that they come in touch with. Interestingly enough, they become toxic to beta cells and they kill off beta cells, right?
Can I add, can we take a step back on that? So how they got modified, such as coming in contact with the reactive oxygen species, right?
How they become modified is, so the EAS consensus paper describes a process where things, LDL gets taken into the intima, right, the inner part of the artery wall, and gets oxidized in there. And there are various explanations, none of which I find super convincing, about, I'll just, telegraph that part, of how they become oxidized. And the reason I don't find them to become super convincing is because there is another process going on, right, in this lipid energy model. It's not properly understood. A lipid energy model of a human body doesn't start at the liver, it starts at the gut, okay? And the gut produces ApoB, which, as you pointed out, is preferentially taken up by the heart, which ApoB 48 in kilomicrons.
Triglycerides off of ApoB, yeah.
Right.
But yes.
Well, but what we also know in animal models and in apparently human models, although as we've discussed prior, we don't have quite as much data as we would like to see, but we do have 3 different papers finding that not only are these ApoB 48 taken up by the that they're taken up by the arteries, right? And you can find preferentially, interestingly enough, the animal models and the human data, the couple of papers we have, show that it is preferentially taken up into the arterial intima. And that casts a bit of a different story here, right? The difference between a normal LDL and either a oxidized, aggregated, or electronegative LDL is oxidized fats, right? The main source of oxidized fats in the modern American diet is going to be the diet, right? They are well demonstrated. They're taken up by the gut, they're incorporated into chylomicrons, and they are spread out into the entire body. Well, if they are being taken up into the arterial intima, that's a fine explanation for how oxidation is getting kicked off there, right? You're eating it and it's delivered there. And that's why I was so surprised by what you said about the heart taking this stuff up, because it doesn't just use lipoprotein lipase. Sometimes it actually will take up the entire particle because it needs more than just the lipids, right? And
That's true, yeah.
So we've got there a very clear explanation of what's known in the business as the postprandial hypothesis of atherosclerosis, which is that the oxidation of these fats and of cholesterol is happening from starting in the diet, starting with what you eat, and then progressively going into your chylomicrons through your, into your bloodstream. And what's interesting is that they've demonstrated that cholesterol, which is a stable molecule, becomes toxic when it becomes oxidized, right? Cholesterol is not packaged into chylomicrons by itself. It's packaged as cholesterol esters, which is a cholesterol molecule and a fatty acid, right? The theory is that when those fatty acids get oxidized, and some of them are extremely susceptible to oxidation or are already oxidized, that's what oxidizes cholesterol. And oxidized cholesterol can be trafficked in between particles from chylomicrons to VLDL and LDL in serum, right? Without having to go through the liver. So
It's probably valuable at this moment, particularly given how deep into
Mhm.
the weeds we've gotten anyway, to emphasize that esterification, that what you're describing. So free cholesterol, people probably even seen the diagram for it. It's the molecule by itself. It's always the same, period. It's always the same chemical composition. Esterification is where it's bound to two fatty acids, right? And at that point, it becomes big and bulky. And so what you're describing, the cholesterol esters, that's where it's esterified. And it's big and bulky, so it'll stay inside that boat, inside that lipoprotein.
right, but it's also a way, I mean, free fatty acids can become toxic in excess, like every fuel in your blood. I mean, too much glucose is bad for you. Too much free fatty acid, I mean, that's one of the symptoms of diabetes, is excess free fatty acid in the blood. Packaging it up as a cholesterol ester is basically a way to make it harmless, right? The same way that your body does with albumin, which is a protein in blood, which is also esterified to fatty acids and is an alternative way of trafficking lipids around the body, in addition to lipoproteins.
All unsaturated fatty acids have that susceptibility, right, to be oxidized
To varying degrees,
and so
correct, yes.
To varying degrees, correct. And the part of where I was going with this is that can theoretically take place anywhere. Obviously, there's some places it's going to take place more likely than others. But to what you're describing in the diet, like I've read different papers that suggest this, that you can end up with the fatty acid that's going to get esterified onto the free cholesterol to then become a cholesterol ester as already being oxidized and somehow making it into the chylomicron that ultimately gets delivered into our bodies, right? That's means
correct.
by which oxidized lipoproteins can end up ultimately making their way in, right?
Right.
And it's not just cholesterol, but there's also triglycerides, which have 3 fatty acids. And if those fatty acids are unsaturated, and if one or more of them, it's possible. There is, for what it's worth, though, in enterocytes and in hepatocytes, enterocytes being in the gut, hepatocytes in the liver, there is actually procedures that they have to try to prevent this.
Right.
But they're not 100% successful.
And they are,
and
there's a great paper on exactly that topic, on the gut processing of various oxidized lipids. And throughout the paper, the author says, not in excess, not in excess, not in excess, right? You're overwhelming.
It's rate limited. Its ability to control that is likely, I believe this for sure, that there's a rate limitation, that you can overwhelm the enterocyte's capability of packaging good chylomicrons that have less of those. Now, again, we have this huge succession, this huge chain of different ways by which we can catch and take care of something that is at risk of creating what's known as a chain oxidation, which is definitely a thing I'm interested in. I'm sure you are as well, which is, look, if I'm going to have something get oxidized, I want it to be in a thing that I have a lot of control over. And that's what I suspect is going to turn out to be the case with lipoproteins, possibly ApoB. In other words, and again, I'll emphasize as a hypothesis, I suspect I would much rather an LDL particle become oxidized where I know there's existing scavenger receptors that can grab it at more of a controlled and comfortable distance than, say, oxidizing the bilayer of a cell that can create a chain oxidative event and actually create a lot of.
Just for the audience, what Dave's talking about here with chain oxidation is the tendency that these oxidized lipids can.
It's not just oxidized lipids. It's any unpaired electron.
It's primarily oxidized. I mean, it's primarily oxidized lipids. I will safely say that, because the main markers.
Fair enough. Primarily, it's fine. I'd agree with that.
The main markers that are used to detect the process are oxidized lipids. Malondialdehyde, 4-HNE are both if we want to measure oxidative stress in the body, which is one of the names for this process, or lipid peroxidation, those are two of the main ways that they measure it. But the problem is those oxidized lipids chain becomes, they can oxidize other lipids. They can oxidize proteins. When these proteins are oxidized, they become damaged because they're malformed now. And even the oxidized proteins can cause other proteins or lipids to oxidize. So you wind up with, back to an in vitro model. In an in vitro model, you can take a protein called cytochrome C and an oxidized lipid called a lipid called cardiolipin. And when you combine them, you will get an uncontrolled reaction that continues until all of the cardiolipin has been oxidized, right? Now, obviously, if that happens in your body, that's catastrophic. And we have things that are designed to prevent that. Antioxidants like, vitamin C, glutathione. Albumin is actually an antioxidant protein in the body, which is one of the reasons why, interestingly enough, low levels of albumin are indicative of a high cardiovascular risk, right? Because your antioxidant capacity, I think, has been reduced to the point where you can start getting these chain reactions. So that's a really important point to make, because the body invests. We discussed before how if you don't have any ApoB, that you probably won't survive to be born. The same thing is true if you don't have any of the primary antioxidant glutathione. You'll never be born because you'll die in utero.
And this is why I'm very interested in the same thing you are, but coming at it from a different direction. I'm interested in host defense as being relevant in its association with lipoproteins themselves. So it's interesting because I was coming at it from the antioxidant standpoint. Alpha tocopherol, better known as vitamin E, is not just something contained in ApoB containing lipoproteins, but it literally protrudes the monolayer. And the very thing we're talking about, the reactive oxygen species that can be in the bloodstream that you don't want to, create a chain oxidative event, they can come into contact with an LDL particle that has an active alpha tocopherol, and it turns both it and the reactive oxygen species into a non-reactive product,
right, which is called
how it works.
Chain breaking. It's a chain breaking antioxidant.
Right. You're pairing the unpaired electron to help resolve the issue, right? But exactly what you described, or certainly what we've kind of bounced around, is we literally have receptors called scavenger receptors, whose job is to bind to things that are either a problem or that are the exhaust of that problem. So for example, with what you were describing around with albumin, if I'm not mistaken, there are scavenger receptors that specifically bind to exhausted albumin, for lack of a better word. And it's a result of greater clearance as to why it is that we're seeing those lower levels of albumin and their association with that poor outcome. Well, by that same token,
it's possible it's also lower levels of production, because protein damage and damage in protein production systems is something that happens later on in metabolic dysfunction.
Yeah, also a possibility. But I certainly think that you may be right in a way beyond the oxidative capacity hypothesis. I am interested in how much you really do have thresholds of compositional demand for the cells themselves. In other words, over time, if you're delivering a payload of these lipids, and I'm talking even just straight up, fatty acids that our cells are composed of alongside the phospholipids. If we're quite literally, providing a more limited amount of the fatty acids we need, and we need a large variety, but in a large part of those are saturated fats, are literally an important component to cell bilayers. You can't have them be all made of polys.
Well, it's, it's kind of important to note that if you eat too much carbohydrate, the body turns it into saturated fat first, and then it can turn it into other things. But that's like the default currency.
Yeah, but it's I'm interested in whether or not. Well, anyway, I'll just digress a little bit. My larger point is, I'm inclined to be a little skeptical as to whether there's any dose level of compositional change with lipoproteins, and I don't think that that's the case you're making. I think you're making a dose makes the poison kind of case with regard to.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a good, one of, I asked a bunch of folks on X, since it's not Twitter anymore, questions. One of them was Dr. Stephen Horvitz. He asked about the difference between natural omega-6 fats versus industrial processed omega-6 fats. And there are two fundamental, so a natural omega-6 fat is going to be like an avocado, which has some omega-6 fat in it, right? You're eating this fruit, or an olive, which has, or a nut, okay? The two obvious differences between processed and unprocessed is that you're limited in how, especially in a natural environment where you have, say, an olive tree that blossoms and produces fruit once a year, as opposed to your supermarket where you can get them year round, right? You're going to be quantity limited. And the other thing is the process of processing these fats, especially the refining process, oxidizes them, right? So I came across an amazing study where the guy was comparing the number of hydroperoxides, the oxidized lipids, in a processed oil straight out of the factory before anything's happened to it, is 400 to 1,000 times as high as LDL, as a normal LDL, right? So essentially every time you eat a processed omega-6 oil, you're getting lipid peroxides, which are then going to, hopefully, if you're not eating too much of them, get dealt with in the gut before they get into serum. But if you eat too much of them, you will be putting these things into your body, and they are toxic. It's not an exaggeration or hyperbole to call them toxic, right?
But that's an important distinction to make already. You're not, so you, in the example you're bringing up right now, an avocado, like if I'm eating avocados all day long, you would anticipate that I would have the same oxidative load dietarily, right? But in theory, there still would be a compositional change to the ultimately resulting lipoproteins.
Right. And we can see that in humans. I mean, seed oils, omega-6 fat rich oils are prescribed to us because they have the effect of lowering LDL cholesterol, right? Those are, the mass version that when you go and get a bottle of Mazola corn oil, are a highly processed food, right? They also prescribe nuts to us. And why do they do that? Well, they're also high in omega-6 fats, and they also lower LDL cholesterol, right? So even though that's the natural...
Do you think they're bad for you? Do you think consuming nuts would have a net detrimental effect under your hypothesis?
You're back to the dose. The dose is going to make the poison. I mean, the one study that we have, the Minnesota coronary experiment that looked at consuming oils, consuming oils in the context of lowering LDL, found that the more your LDL was lowered, the worse your cardiovascular disease outcome was, right? Nuts have lots of other things that a bottle of canola corn oil does not. They have lots of nutrients. They have vitamins. The epidemiology that we have shows that nuts are generally health promoting. But as Dr. Eads wrote years ago in this awesome blog post called "Are Nuts Paleo?" he talked about how he grew up on a farm, and every year they would go out to harvest nuts off the trees. It only happened once a year. And then to eat the nuts, he would put them in a canvas bag and run over them with his pickup truck because they were so hard to get out of the shells, right? Well, if you're going to the supermarket and you're buying jars of nuts, you're going to be eating a lot more than you would be in the natural circumstance, right? And it's interesting that the only population we know of hunter-gatherers who consumed a large degree of nuts were the Bushmen and what is it, Kunsan, they're called? I'm sorry if I'm misremembering that. But they're also the only population of hunter-gatherers who've ever been shown to have insulin resistance.
And
right?
but pathological insulin resistance, or like did they do a test on?
They did an oral glucose tolerance test and they failed.
Oh, I'll concede. I'm not.
So
I have my reservations on no GTT versus fasting insulin in particular, but we'll set that aside for another time.
well,
But
what was interesting about this is that they only failed the glucose tolerance test when they were eating their high nut diet. If they went off out of the woods and went and lived in a village, they would pass the oral glucose tolerance test.
oh no, that's interesting. That's actually really interesting.
Right. Which, I mean, if you want to induce insulin resistance in humans, the way you do it is by injecting omega-6 fats into their veins. So it's not a huge stretch to think that eating an excess amount of omega-6 fats would have the same effect as injecting
Isn't that E-fats though? Can't you infuse, for example, free saturated fats?
If you again, as I was saying, an excess amount of fatty acids can be toxic. So yes, if you inject too much fatty acid, you will produce problems just because you're exceeding the expected amount in the bloodstream, right? But if you're injecting the correct amount, you're only going to see that effect with omega-6 fats. And I mean, we have at this point a huge body of evidence in humans that that's the case.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, I'm certainly one that believes there's a systemic level of Randall cycle in play, such that, like right now, my own myocytes have a higher concentration of free fatty acids in the cytosol, resulting in lower GLUT4 expression. And therefore, there's, for example, more glucose sparing, which is why I would fail an OGTT unless I, take the next few days or whatever to go back to a mixed diet, in which case less Randall cycle, more GLUT4 expression, more disposal of the glucose when I do a bolus of glucose, for example, right? But that's relevant when considering things like lipotoxicity, because I know that's been a lot more discussed lately. But yeah.
One point I wanted to make, we've discussed a lot about oxidized LDL over the years, and in the EAS consensus paper, they discuss three types of modified LDL, right? Ox-LDL, aggregated LDL, and electronegative LDL. Now, when you oxidize LDL, what happens is it becomes electronegative, right? So my understanding, although there's a bit of back and forth in the literature about this, the definition they're using of oxidized is that all electronegative LDL is oxidized LDL. And in the past, we've discussed how oxidized LDL is rather rare in the blood, right? Which is one of the reasons why folks who don't like my hypothesis will say, okay, well, that can't be the cause because it's very uncommon. What do you think is the level of electronegative LDL in the blood of somebody with cardiovascular disease?
I don't know.
Up to 10%.
Oh, wow. of the total population of LDL particles.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and here's what I would say that would probably support your hypothesis in that regard. And part of where I was going is I still think that this is a threshold game. I think
Yeah.
that when an LDL particle becomes, getting back to the 3D dimensions of it, the more modified an LDL particle, the faster it'll get removed by scavenger receptors in the periphery. And this, by the way, is also of interest to me in how much you can make LDL particles susceptible as a means by which you lower LDL by that net effect. Not necessarily that that's desirable. I don't know, right? But I'm skeptical as to whether we can assume it's desirable. But I definitely think that that's rate limited. I definitely don't think that you have unlimited capacity to scavenger receptor out all of these oxidized LDL particles such that there's a point, a threshold, where if they're at clear and detectable levels from an assay that I like, we'll get to that in a moment. I think you know where I'm going on that.
Yeah.
Then I would say that's a dark sign, because I feel like you're now at a point that your own system can't keep up with the degree of existing oxidized ApoB containing lipoprotein removal. Now, what do I mean by assay I don't like? You and I know this. Your listeners may not know this.
Well, I learned this from you, so do continue.
Yes. It was, so first of all, I literally did experiments 5 years ago. I was hypothesizing correctly that oxidized LDL would track with my LDL particle count, and literally did an experiment, the first time I'd ever done this, where I not only got my blood at LabCorp, but I also had them take in additional vials, which I then shipped myself via FedEx 3 times. And not only did the ox-LDL track with my LDL particle count, whether I went hypocaloric or hypercaloric, but its R2 was preposterous. It was 0.99. I never had that with any experiment that I'd ever had. I later find from Sam Semekis, he had already done research on this and showed that this assay is just not a good assay, because they were able to just do this in vitro, I believe, if you want to call it that. They were just able to add non-modified LDL particles to a solution, do a test against it, and sure enough, it tracked with the non-modified LDL particles.
So so just for the audience, what Dave is saying here is that this is the Mercodia assay, and it's a commercial assay that's sold and that's commonly used in research studies as well as clinically. It reacts to LDL. It doesn't only react to oxidized LDL. So when you measure your LDL with a Mercodia assay, you're not measuring ox-LDL, you're measuring LDL. And the same problem, incidentally, can be true with the test that Semekis uses, but he does the test in such a way that he's getting an idea of how much oxidation you have in the LDL particles.
And that's where I was going, is Sam Semekis has a test, full disclosure, it's his own IP, but it also met with my prediction ahead of that. I love that I predicted one of these tests would do what it did.
Just to really go back though and give credit where it's due, it's not Semekis's test. It was he came up with the OXPL/ApoB, I think.
Yeah.
But the antibody was discovered by Steinberg and Whitstone, the 2 gentlemen who discovered that it's oxidized omega-6 fats that are converting the LDL into a modified LDL.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it goes all the way back to the beginning of this story.
Yeah. So what are we talking about here? To simplify it, because I think this is the easiest way for people to recognize it. If you were the first assay is looking for any modification of LDL. So if it's minimally modified, which is to say it's like a scratch on a car, versus maximally modified, which is to say a car is totaled, it's a pass fail. So it's counting all of the different cars with any damage at all in all the cars in a city, right? And therefore it tends to track which is total cars. Here's the thing: some amount of ApoB containing lipoproteins that ultimately become LDL they will be modified. Though some amount of them in the manufacturing process will be minimally modified. Well, in the case of the assay you just mentioned, ox-phospholipid ApoB, which by the way is through a Boston Heart. I've gotten it many times. I love it. We're getting it for our folks at the study, lean mass hyperresponders.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. It is granular in that it's not looking at just the LDL particle in the pass fail. It's looking at phospholipids like the assay suggests, but quantifies the amount of the damage in the aggregate overall, such that you can get a sense of how much is actually being oxidized. Now, where this becomes really relevant is if you know that there's some amount of oxidation that's part of the manufacture process. So some amount of them will already
particle, or the VLDL particle correctly. Yeah.
ApoB containing lipoprotein, I have to say it that way because they're not necessarily starting as LDL. They start as VLDL and then change. Anyway, if you agree with me that that probably is part of the process and agree with Sam Zemeckis, you'd say the same. It's why this equation of ox-phospholipid ApoB over ApoB becomes a powerful predictor of cardiovascular risk. So it's basically how much oxidized phospholipids you have against the population of total ApoB. And that to me is very suggestive of that threshold we're describing.
Right.
And to be fair, full disclosure, I've predicted this entire time, and I do to this day, that we're ultimately going to find lean mass hyperresponders probably have the most ridiculous version of that that's ever been studied. They're going to have very high ApoB, the denominator, but the numerator, ox-phospholipid ApoB, I think is going to be low, in which case that fraction is going to be ridiculous. So I don't want to make it, I'm both making that prediction, but I also don't want to suggest that that's the end all be all.
Well, Dave, I have to ask here, since you're a notorious tease, do you know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer to that because I'm blinded from that data.
Okay.
I wish I did. I can't wait. There's so many pieces of data that are going to be coming out of our study that I'll share this piece since, why not? We're banking some amount of the blood, and a portion of it is going to be set aside to go to Finland, which is getting very advanced lipidome metrics, where we're going to be able to get deep composition of each strata of ApoB containing lipoprotein. What its inside is, what its outside is, everything. And I'm so obsessed with that moment, which will be at the very end of the study, and so afraid that there'll be some problem with the shipping because these things have to stay frozen at minus 80 degrees. I've said this, and I'm not even totally kidding. I may just ask Budoff if I can walk it over myself, if I can just fly to Finland and with the case with the handcuffs,
smoking in the seat next to you.
I might just buy the seat next to me so that it could just be just like sitting there, and I could just have my eyes on it at all times. Anyway,
and I mean, just to Dave's point, these fats are so delicate that just over time they will start to oxidize.
Yeah.
And even freezing them is not a complete protection against it. So you really, they've going way back, they've figured out that I forget the experiment, but Browning Goldstein, in one of their experiments, I think I've got this right, they realized that there was some contaminant in the BSA serum that they were using, and that the reason they were, seeing this funny result was because of the contaminant, and not, and ever since then, everybody's added in this chemical that protects against that one little thing happening so that they can get accurate results, right? These are extremely delicate experiments. Dave's not being hyperanal here. It's
my God.
It's a real concern.
My God, I really do believe we're going to have so much novel data, and that will be a treasure trove of novel data. And I've been predicting for a long time, I'm finally going to get this, that if you take same size LDL particle, somebody who's very severely type 2 diabetic, same size LDL particle, let's say 22.5 nanometers, you're going to find that it's more triglyceride rich and cholesterol ester poor than a lean mass hyperresponder, which is going to be cholesterol ester rich and triglyceride poor. And that's going to be more indicative of what's been upstream of them for how the system is correctly, in my opinion, or incorrectly delivering.
And we already know that the diabetic is going to have more oxidized phospholipids in their LDL. That's been shown for years.
Probably. And again, I think that there's the threshold factor. I think that we're going to see that a lot more relevantly in the LMHR population. We should, okay, so I know this is going to be a marathon level thing, and I do have a hard stop. It's in half an hour. We should absolutely hit the ApoB 48 though, because it's kind of an exciting new twist on things we haven't had a chance to cover.
Well, I got into that a little bit before, but.
Oh, go
ahead. Yeah, so, the ApoB lipoprotein has two forms, ApoB 100 and ApoB 48. They're, basically the same molecule up to a certain point, and then the ApoB 48 is truncated.
There are two, probably the better way to frame it is there are two different lineages. The ApoB 48 is the type of protein attached, it's the spine of the lipoprotein that originates in the gut. That's the 48. And the ApoB 100 is the spine of the lipoprotein that starts in the liver. Right. And that's super relevant.
But part of the way they're identical. And then the ApoB 100 has extra, stuff on it, to use the scientific term. Which is interesting because the difference between the two means they are processed differently, right? For instance, ApoB 100, when it's oxidized, is taken up by the scavenger receptors. ApoB 48, if I'm remembering this correctly, is, still taken up by its regular receptor when it gets oxidized. So it's a better way of transferring oxidized lipids into a cell. They're dealt differently by macrophages, right? So there are a lot of differences in them. But the interesting thing is we know that oxidized fats and oxidized cholesterol can get into the body via ApoB 48 coming in from the gut, because you're eating things with oxidized fats and oxidized cholesterol, and your body is not capable of, as Dave was saying, protecting you from all of it, right? So some of it's going to get in. And it is taken up into cells throughout your body. I mean, this is your primary energy delivery system, what you eat, right? And it is also absorbed, apparently preferentially, based on the animal and the human data we have, into the arterial lining, right? Once it's in there, one would expect, from what we see with these oxidized lipids in other places, that it will cause inflammation. So if you're wondering where's the inflammation causing inside the arterial wall, oxidized fats cause inflammation, right? They are a toxic particle. They damage the cells, damage the proteins in the cells. The E06, this is a really important point. The E06 antibody that Semikis has worked with, and that is the functional component of the OXPL ApoB test, doesn't just react against oxidized phospholipids in ApoB. It also reacts against oxidized cardiolipin, including linoleic acid, which is the fat that's delivered by dietary seed oils, and it also reacts to bacteria, right? So essentially, the easiest way to understand this is you're having an autoimmune reaction, right? Your body is interpreting these proteins as being bacterial in origin. In the case of oxidized cardiolipin, it's coming only from the mitochondria, and the mitochondria are essentially bacteria inside the body. So your body is having a reaction as if it was being infected. This is why in the cardiovascular literature, they call it sterile inflammation, right? You're having an inflammatory reaction without an infection. And the reaction is to these oxidized lipids.
I may have some differences with you in the way that you're describing that. I should first emphasize something. I think that a lot of present oxidative lipoprotein handling is actually quite routine and well under control. I think a lot of times people are thinking of it as like a match in gasoline, once it shows up.
Well, it's like, yes, I totally agree with that. I mean, the analogy I like to use is it's like smoking, right? If you smoke a single cigarette, you are not going to get lung cancer. You have to smoke for a lot for 20 years. Your body has robust systems to protect you against these processes.
Yeah, and in that sense, to the degree with which something is getting, try to imagine you're cooking in the kitchen and you're already used to fire being a part of your cooking process in the kitchen, and you have ways by which you handle it if the fire spread to the paper plate I have nearby the stove, but I'm not panicking. It's on my granite countertop, etc. Right, and there's a point in which somebody put out way too many paper plates or something along those lines, or somebody brought a lot more, or I'm literally having them bring more things that might be on fire to throw in the sink. Right. And it's clear that it's now getting out of control. And so there are measures that I may already know to take in place. I've got a fire extinguisher under my sink that I know to pull out. Oh, that's actually not okay. Fine. Call the fire department. Goodness, this is getting really bad. Like, there's points of escalation. What concerns me is that so many variations of the cardiovascular concept assume that the etiology of these things are a positive feedback loop, and that they all become exactly what I described, that the moment any fire is introduced, it's going to have that whole thing without the escalations. The escalation in what you're describing as autoimmune, I would take some issue with thinking of as autoimmune. Is obviously there's some degree of fail safes that seem to be in place, period, for that degree of what's good.
No, I mean, to make your point, one of the uses for oxidized LDL is in defense, right? Your neutrophils, which are another type of white blood cell, will oxidize LDL in the course of defending your body against a bacterial infection.
Yeah, like oxidative bursts, exactly.
The oxidative bursts, right?
Right.
They're producing, they're, among other things, they're producing oxidized omega-6 lipids. And one of the things that they do is oxidize LDL. And then, for instance, in the context of a staph infection, the bacteria is in this environment with a lot of oxidized LDL, and it says, oh, okay, this is not a good environment for me to be in, right?
Yeah, and I think maybe I was taking more issue with just the term autoimmune, in that it's not.
That actually strengthens the autoimmune argument, because basically what you're seeing here is this sterile inflammation, right? Inflammation, your body attacking self. And where else do we see this? We see this with poison ivy.
But that's usually described as a pathogenic net negative process, that you're.
That's right.
That it's attacking itself in a fashion that, if it were prevented from doing so, would be a net positive.
Well, right? Okay, but the poison ivy analogy, poison ivy is an oil produced by, we all know, plants. Believe it or not, it's actually really well studied, because in Japan, lacquer is made from from the oil that poison ivy contains, urushiol. And it turns out the pathogenicity of urushiol depends on how much polyunsaturated fat it has, right? What it is doing is modifying your cell in such a way that the body thinks it's foreign, right? It's mimicking, take a little stretch here, it's mimicking a bacterial infection, and it is causing your white blood cells to say, okay, we have to clear this out. It's the exact same process that's happening in atherosclerosis.
Yeah, and I'll consider I don't know that one as well. I don't know on the poison ivy.
Right. But yeah, to your point, it's a threshold response. And I mean, when we see that threshold, even in the context of an infection, when that threshold starts getting out of control, you're looking at the condition we call sepsis, which is, A, a massive infection, and B, a massive overreaction to that infection.
Maybe it's I mean, let me put it this way. Some amount of pathology we look at, we're often looking at without enough consideration toward what the trade-off is in play. So you take something
absolutely.
like a defibrillator. Defibrillators can definitely kill people and have killed people, right? But it's expected that on net, it's a beneficial trade-off such that we still want to have them in the hospitals, right?
Right.
And we might, by the way, still be wrong. It could be that defibrillators aren't a net benefit overall, and that if you weren't using them every time and tried to take other measures, it'd be fine.
Yeah,
but I don't.
You're getting to a very important point here, which is that all of these processes are natural processes at the right amount.
Right. And this is where I'd probably support where I think you might want to go with regard to, like, for example, this is why ancestral environments, right?
I get bent out of shape. I mean, I try to be really careful to say this, and I'll say it right now, is the correct amount of omega-6 is not 0, right? This is something
right.
that your body expects to get and has always gotten and is in almost every food that you will eat. I mean, even things that you wouldn't think of as being fatty, like a potato or rice, are going to have some omega-6 fats, or beef. Sorry, everybody. The point is not to get it to 0. The point is, I mean, it's like water. You can drink so much water that you get water poisoning. Does that mean you should never drink water? No, of course not.
There are a lot of
don't drink gallons of it at a go.
There are a lot of PUFAs that are essential fatty acids. And it is true. It's probably my favorite straw man that I see of you sometimes. People going, Tucker doesn't think you should have any PUFAs in the diet. I'm like, I've never seen him say anything remotely close to that ever. But yes, and this is to bring it back to sepsis for a sec. It sucks, but there are things like that for which I want to know the context of what would otherwise be a more typical environment, and what those trade-off considerations are. And this brings us back to atherosclerosis, ironically, because atherosclerosis is another one of those examples where it very well could be a form of what's typically referred to as hemostasis, in that it may be somewhere after secondary hemostasis, but before full-blown thin fibrous cap that's still trying to make the best of what it has with what it can do. It's too hard to say without being able to have more study that can more effectively determine that trade-off that may or may not be in place. It could be that it is a net detriment in all cases. But I don't know. It's hard to say at this point.
Right. Anyway, since we've been at this for a very long time now, thank you, Dave. A couple of people asked some questions that I just want to hit on. Some of them we already hit on. Eric Rogers asked about ApoB 48. I think we can check that out. Check that off. Shashi Iyengar asked about palm oil, processed versus unprocessed. I think we kind of touched up on that. Palm oil is pretty low in omega-6 fats. The difference between natural omega-6 fats and industrial processed omega-6 fats, we touched on. How does adipose LA track with blood lipids? I honestly don't know the answer to that exactly. I would expect that it would really depend on a lot of other things going on.
I think it's a long-term study, and one I would definitely be interested in. Definitely. I'm very interested in structural composition of cells changing over time based on diet, especially the fatty acids that are in the diet. I want to know if somebody has a high PUFA diet, and by high, I mean probably what you would consider a nightmare, which is just like it's almost entirely PUFA oil based, right? But to where they don't have other forms of fats, such as like very low saturated fat, very high PUFA, but not, again, dose makes the poison, right? How do you get to a point where you have enough PUFA that perhaps you put demand on the body to do de novo lipogenesis to make those saturated fats you were describing earlier, palmitic acid, for example? Would we find folks like that had a predominantly high?
Stephen Kinane has done research, and he's shown that a lot of the carbons that are in linoleic acid are recycled into saturated fats and cholesterol, like the majority of them.
Interesting.
And there's, one of the big confounders, there was a paper done in the 50s looking at atherosclerosis in rats, and they looked specifically at peanut oil, and they found that peanut oil caused atherosclerosis in these rats. But if you hydrogenated the linoleic acid into stearic acid, which is a saturated fat, it didn't cause atherosclerosis anymore. The real mind bender here is that if you gave them nothing but linoleic acid, it also didn't cause cardiovascular disease. It was only mixed fats containing linoleic acid that caused cardiovascular disease, which is, of course, what we all eat.
Were they examining stool samples? I'm curious if they had more pass through.
I don't recall.
Interesting.
Yeah. But so there's a lot going on. Specific own your labs values to check for before and after removing seed oils from diet.
Yeah.
You don't have the ApoB or the OxPL/ApoB test.
I do not. So in that sense, I would almost be ironically recommending outside of Own Your Labs. Boston Heart Diagnostics is the name of the company that offers that assay that I really do like. And we'd love to integrate with them, by the way, with Own Your Labs. But unfortunately, there's some logistical issues behind the scenes that just have to do with our model. But for what it's worth, if you're listening to this, ask your doctor if you can get a Boston Heart's diagnostic test. They may already have an account with Boston Heart. If they don't, you may want to try calling Boston Heart directly and seeing if you can order it, and they may be able to help match make you with somebody that's, where you're at. I do like that test quite a bit. I'm sure there are other tests, but I would actually kind of punt to you. You might have more specific tests that you have in mind outside of that one that you would suggest.
I would say that. I would say the Omega Quant test a lot of people have done, and I mean that's just looking at the raw levels. There was a fellow on Twitter who thought he was eating a low omega-6 diet, and his Omega Quant test showed that he was not. He was, eating a lot of salad and salad dressing. So, I think those tests are useful in keeping you honest. It's especially when you're looking at trace nutrients like omega-6 fats, it's easy to miss something. It's easy to fool yourself. So I find value for them in that way. You could theoretically do an adipose lipid test,
biopsy.
But that's a biopsy, with a big needle and, yikes.
Yeah, again, but it's a great test because it's probably, I I myself haven't done one yet, but I mean to. I'm very interested because it'll probably be somewhat reflective of your composition.
Well, we know Stefan Guillenet wrote a paper about that. It's clearly reflective of long-term consumption of omega-6 fats.
That's what I would expect.
Adipose. Yeah.
And it's worth mentioning, overnutrition can be a little more concern when it comes to fat soluble vitamins because it's a longer time scale. You can't see overconsumption as easily, and you can't see underconsumption as easily because of the scale of time.
And they're
compared to
they concentrate in fat cells,
right, compared to water soluble.
Right.
So that's where a biopsy actually makes a lot of sense. It'd be pretty interesting.
Right. And the last one, something I don't know Fish oil and effects. Michael J asked fish oil and effects of supplementation on cholesterol, supplements versus eating actual fish. I know what my answer is for that, but what do you think about that question?
I mean, fish, first of all, odds are, I think most people in the Western world probably end up a little bit lighter on the omegas that come from fish than they probably could benefit from. So I myself try to make a point at consuming more fish on purpose. I'm not always successful at it. I did get a little salmon in last night, which I was happy about.
There you
But
go.
as far as its net effect on cholesterol, I think all else being equal, I'm doubtful it has a meaningful impact, at least in a substantial level. But here's the thing. I'm always going to always caveating this with virtually anything. Whenever you say, hey, I'm thinking of supplementing X because I heard it fixes Y. The very first thing I want to ask is, are you deficient in X? Because if you're deficient in X, that's very relevant to whether it's fixing Y. And unfortunately, a lot of times, omega-3s are a great example. I think, for example, I have a first-degree family member who I'm very happy she's consuming a lot of extra omega-3s because she's deficient in omega-3s. And so it's been very helpful to her. If that had an impact, a further impact on lipid profile, I don't know that I would care that much because I feel it's already confounded. She is a confounded individual because she had a deficiency in the first place. So I can't put a lot of stock in that information. So by the same token, if it's about whether or not you're taking it to change your lipid profile, if there's a deficiency there, I don't know that it gives you a lot of additional information to work with.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I first fixed my diet, I took cod liver oil and just craved it. Couldn't go to bed without my spoonful of cod liver oil for about 6 months, and I've never touched it since. And I suspect that I was probably deficient in it at that point. And, you know, once there was an experiment done in the 1920s with a kid who had rickets, and they let him eat cod liver oil, and he ate it until his rickets were cured, and then he never touched it again, right? Because it's high in vitamin D and the fat soluble vitamins that you build bones out of. So I totally agree with what you said. I do think one other, fish oil is prescribed to lower triglycerides. I think if your triglycerides are too high, you should probably fix the rest of your diet and not try and band-aid it by taking fish oil. And additionally, fish has phospholipid bound omega-3 fats, which fish oil does not have. And those are digested and delivered differently, right? So those are preferentially delivered to the brain versus the triglycerides. So I think if you think you're deficient and you think you should be eating them, then eat the fish, not the fish oil, because you want to get both forms of it. And the number one thing, according to the International Society of Fatty Acids and Lipids, the two ways to lower your omega-6 the two ways to raise your serum omega-3 fat levels are supplement or avoid omega-6 fats. So that should definitely be a consideration.
Yeah. There's and incidentally, in very recent times, I want to say in just like the last few years, there's been some studies on supplementation of especially EPA for heart disease. However, this was in populations that already had hypertriglyceridemia, so they had high triglycerides in the first place.
Right.
And to be fair, these were interventions that were from drug trials where the trialists would insist you want to be sure you get this purified EPA like they're selling, but it is the actual EPA. So I myself suspect if I had a family member, they weren't interested in changing their diet, they did have concerns of heart disease, and they were just asking for different things that are quote unquote natural, that's probably something I would suggest as a possibility to consider.
And there's, I mean, a lot of people are concerned with oxidized fish oil. Doesn't seem to have much of an effect. There was a study that just came out that looked at oxidized versus non-oxidized fish oils. Most fish oils that you can buy are oxidized, especially if they're flavored. But
Right.
they didn't really see anything they could point to in the people who were eating them that would indicate some negative outcome. So, I would definitely lean towards fish just
Yeah.
because you
I
get the whole
mean,
package. But
yeah, I've managed to talk one of the challenge cases in my family to just doing exactly that. Rather than supplementing or finding a new drug, I was able to at least get them into doing that. They seem to want to have it both ways. They seem to want to have the diet that they're on, but not take other interventions, even drug interventions. And so, I try to get across whatever advice I can, but with that caveat that,
nothing's harder to deal with than family members and their diets.
yeah, yeah, that's true. I know this from experience, that's for sure.
Yep. All right. Well, you have a couple of things that you need to plug.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, obviously, first and foremost, there's the research itself, which is under citizensciencefoundation.org. I'll just go ahead and say we've kind of soft launched it to some degree. We are, in fact, going to do a companion study to the lean mass hyperresponder study. And so if anybody wants to make their contributions, we appreciate it. We are a bona fide 501c3 public charity, so it is tax deductible. And it helps a good cause, by the way. We are completing this first study, and we hopefully will have some data out there soon. There's, of course, the blog cholesterolcode.com, although I'll concede we don't update it as much as we used to. And then there's, of course, Own Your Labs, where you can get not only private listing, but we incentivize it for citizen science. You can submit your anonymized data for 10% off to help the community, because basically it's going to be an open data archive that is anonymized, but that will hopefully help advance citizen science.
And you're recruiting for your second study?
Not yet. We have to go through all the stuff, right? We have to settle things internally, then we have to go through an IRB. I would guess that we'll probably start recruiting early next year. Yes.
Okay. And and you're changing your criteria a little bit. So if somebody was an edge case and got rejected from the first one and they're interested in participating, they should give it another go.
Yeah, it's more relaxed for this second time around. I can't say what that criteria is until we all settle on it, but then I'll be announcing it from the rooftops once we do.
Okay. That's awesome. Thank you, Dave. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was good.
Yeah.
Anything you want to cover that we didn't cover? I can always clip it in.
I should think of. I mean, it is pretty funny because we really probably could have just kept BSing for like a long time. I realized we still had other things, like we didn't get to the vasorum. We didn't really get into the ApoB 48, even though that's a fun little aside, and maybe we'll get back to it. You probably could have spoken a lot more to it than I did. I only gone down that rabbit hole for like 24 hours. That was a while ago. Man, but for real, if we find that plaques are predominantly ApoB 48, I've only come up with about 3 theories that could help explain them, and all of them are far away from what anybody's describing.
Well, and the thing I didn't get into is, the EAS consensus paper talks about that, and Jan Boren has done research in that, except they're not calling them chylomicrons anymore. They're calling them triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. And they're talking about how they're significantly affecting residual cardiovascular disease risk after you account for LDL. And, just say what you mean, guys.
No, they know. Yeah. Don't.